This is section 41 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, Chapter 41. Henry Brierly was at the Dilworthys constantly, and on such terms of intimacy that he came and went without question. The senator was not an inhospitable man. He liked to have guests in his house, and Harry's gay humor and rattling way entertained him, for even the most devout men and busy statesmen must have hours of relaxation. Harry himself believed that he was of great service in the university business, and that the success of the scheme depended upon him to a great degree. He spent many hours in talking it over with the senator after dinner. He went so far as to consider whether it would be worth his while to take the professorship of civil engineering in the new institution. But it was not the senator's society, nor his dinners, at which this scapegoat remarked that there was too much grace and too little wine, which attracted him to the house. The fact was, the poor fellow hung around there day after day for the chance of seeing Laura for 5 minutes at a time. For her presence at dinner he would endure the long bore of the senator's talk afterwards, while Laura was off at some assembly or excused herself on the plea of fatigue. Now and then he accompanied her to some reception, and rarely, on off nights, he was blessed with her company in the parlor, when he sang, and was chatty and vivacious, and performed 100 little tricks of imitation and ventriloquism, and made himself as entertaining as a man could be. It puzzled him not a little that all his fascination seemed to go for so little with Laura. It was beyond his experience with women. Sometimes Laura was exceedingly kind, and petted him a little, and took the trouble to exert her powers of pleasing, and to entangle him deeper and deeper. But this, it angered him afterwards to think, was in private. In public she was beyond his reach, and never gave occasion to the suspicion that she had any affair with him. He was never permitted to achieve the dignity of a serious flirtation with her in public. "Why do you treat me so?" he once said reproachfully. "Treat you how?" asked Laura in a sweet voice, lifting her eyebrows. "You know well enough. You let other fellows monopolize you in society, and you are as indifferent to me as if we were strangers." "Can I help it if they are attentive? Can I be rude? But we are such old friends, Mr. Brierly, that I didn't suppose you would be jealous." "I think I must be a very old friend, then, by your conduct towards me. By the same rule, I should judge that Colonel Selby must be very new." Laura looked up quickly, as if about to return an indignant answer to such impertinence, but she only said, "Well, what of Colonel Selby, Saucebox?" "Nothing, probably, you'll care for. Your being with him so much is the town talk, that's all." "What do people say?" asked Laura calmly. "Oh, they say a good many things. You were offended, though, to have me speak of it?" "Not in the least. You are my true friend. I feel that I can trust you. You wouldn't deceive me, Harry?" throwing into her eyes a look of trust and tenderness that melted away all his petulance and distrust. "What do you say?" "Some say that you've lost your head about him. Others that you don't care any more for him than you do for a dozen others, but that he is completely fascinated with you and about to desert his wife. And others say it is nonsense to suppose you would entangle yourself with a married man, and that your intimacy only arises from the matter of the cotton claims, for which he wants your influence with Dilworthy. But you know everybody is talked about more or less in Washington. I shouldn't care, but I wish you wouldn't have so much to do with Selby, Laura," continued Harry, fancying that he was now upon such terms that his advice would be heeded. "And you believe these slanders?" "I don't believe anything against you, Laura, but Colonel Selby does not mean you any good. I know you wouldn't be seen with him if you knew his reputation." "Do you know him?" Laura asked, as indifferently as she could. "Only a little. I was at his lodgings in Georgetown a day or two ago with Colonel Sellers. Sellers wanted to talk with him about some patent remedy he has, eye water or something of that sort, which he wants to introduce into Europe. Selby is going abroad very soon." Laura started in spite of her self-control. "And his wife? Does he take his family? Did you see his wife?" "Yes. A dark little woman, rather worn. Must have been pretty once, though. Has 3 or 4 children, one of them a baby. They'll all go, of course. She said she should be glad enough to get away from Washington. You know, Selby has got his claim allowed, and they say he has had a run of luck lately at Morrissey's." Laura heard all this in a kind of stupor, looking straight at Harry without seeing him. "Is it possible," she was thinking, "that this base wretch, after all his promises, will take his wife and children and leave me? Is it possible the town is saying all these things about me?" And a look of bitterness coming into her face. "Does the fool think he can escape so?" "You are angry with me, Laura," said Harry, not comprehending in the least what was going on in her mind. "Angry?" she said, forcing herself to come back to his presence. "With you? Oh, no! I am angry with the cruel world, which pursues an independent woman as it never does a man. I'm grateful to you, Harry. I'm grateful to you for telling me of that odious man." And she rose from her chair and gave him her pretty hand, which the silly fellow took and kissed and clung to. And he said many silly things before she disengaged herself gently and left him, saying it was time to dress for dinner. And Harry went away, excited and a little hopeful, but only a little. The happiness was only a gleam, which departed and left him thoroughly miserable. She never would love him, and she was going to be the devil besides. He couldn't shut his eyes to what he saw, nor his ears to what he heard of her. What had come over this thrilling young lady-killer? It was a pity to see such a gay butterfly broken on a wheel. Was there something good in him, after all, that had been touched? He was, in fact, madly in love with this woman. It is not for us to analyze the passion and say whether it was a worthy one. It absorbed his whole nature and made him wretched enough. If he deserved punishment, what more would you have? Perhaps this love was kindling a new heroism in him. He saw the road on which Laura was going clearly enough, though he did not believe the worst he heard of her. He loved her too passionately to credit that for a moment, and it seemed to him that if he could compel her to recognize her position and his own devotion, she might love him, and that he could save her. His love was so far ennobled and become a very different thing from its beginning in Hawkeye. Whether he ever thought that if he could save her from ruin he could give her up himself is doubtful. Such a pitch of virtue does not occur often in real life, especially in such natures as Harry's, whose generosity and unselfishness were matters of temperament rather than habits or principles. He wrote a long letter to Laura, an incoherent, passionate letter, pouring out his love as he could not do in her presence, and warning her as plainly as he dared of the dangers that surrounded her and the risks she ran of compromising herself in many ways. Laura read the letter, with a little sigh, maybe, as she thought of other days, but with contempt also, and she put it into the fire with the thought, "They are all alike." Harry was in the habit of writing to Philip freely, and boasting also about his doings, as he could not help doing and remain himself. Mixed up with his own exploits and his daily triumphs as a lobbyist, especially in the matter of the new university, in which Harry was to have something handsome, were amusing sketches of Washington society, hints about Dilworthy, stories about Colonel Sellers, who had become a well-known character, and wise remarks upon the machinery of private legislation for the public good, which greatly entertained Philip in his convalescence. Laura's name occurred very often in these letters, at first in casual mention as the belle of the season, carrying everything before her with her wit and beauty, and then more seriously, as if Harry did not exactly like so much general admiration of her, and was a little nettled by her treatment of him. This was so different from Harry's usual tone about women that Philip wondered a good deal over it. Could it be possible that he was seriously affected? Then came stories about Laura, town talk, gossip which Harry denied the truth of indignantly. But he was evidently uneasy, and at length wrote in such miserable spirits that Philip asked him squarely what the trouble was. Was he in love? Upon this Harry made a clean breast of it, and told Philip all he knew about the Selby affair, and Laura's treatment of him, sometimes encouraging him and then throwing him off, and finally his belief that she would go to the bad if something was not done to arouse her from her infatuation. He wished Philip was in Washington. He knew Laura, and she had a great respect for his character, his opinions, his judgment. Perhaps he, as an uninterested person, in whom she would have some confidence, and as one of the public, could say something to her that would show her where she stood. Philip saw the situation clearly enough. Of Laura he knew not much, except that she was a woman of uncommon fascination, and he thought from what he had seen of her in Hawkeye, her conduct towards him and towards Harry, of not too much principle. Of course he knew nothing of her history. He knew nothing seriously against her, and if Harry was desperately enamored of her, why should he not win her if he could? If, however, she had already become what Harry uneasily felt she might become, was it not his duty to go to the rescue of his friend, and try to save him from any rash act on account of a woman that might prove to be entirely unworthy of him? For trifler and visionary as he was, Harry deserved a better fate than this. Philip determined to go to Washington and see for himself. He had other reasons also. He began to know enough of Mr. Bolton's affairs to be uneasy. Pennybacker had been there several times during the winter, and he suspected that he was involving Mr. Bolton in some doubtful scheme. Pennybacker was in Washington, and Philip thought he might perhaps find out something about him and his plans that would be of service to Mr. Bolton. Philip had enjoyed his winter very well, for a man with his arm broken and his head smashed. With two such nurses as Ruth and Alice, illness seemed to him rather a nice holiday, and every moment of his convalescence had been precious and all too fleeting. With a young fellow of the habits of Philip, such injuries cannot be counted on to tarry long, even for the purpose of love-making, and Philip found himself getting strong with even disagreeable rapidity. During his first weeks of pain and weakness, Ruth was unceasing in her ministrations. She quietly took charge of him, and with a gentle firmness resisted all attempts of Alice or anyone else to share to any great extent the burden with her. She was clear, decisive, and peremptory in whatever she did, but often when Philip opened his eyes in those first days of suffering and found her standing by his bedside, he saw a look of tenderness in her anxious face that quickened his already feverish pulse, a look that remained in his heart long after he closed his eyes. Sometimes he felt her hand on his forehead, and did not open his eyes for fear she would take it away. He watched for her coming to his chamber. He could distinguish her light footstep from all others. If this is what is meant by women practicing medicine, thought Philip to himself, I like it. Ruth, said he one day when he was getting to be quite himself, I believe in it. Believe in what? Why, in women physicians. Then I'd better call in Mrs. Dr. Longstreet. Oh, no, one will do, one at a time. I think I should be well tomorrow if I thought I should never have any other. The physician thinks thee mustn't talk, Philip, said Ruth, putting her finger on his lips. But, Ruth, I want to tell you that I should wish I never got well if— There, thee must not talk. Thee is wandering again. And Ruth closed his lips, with a smile on her own that broadened into a merry laugh as she ran away. Philip was not weary, however, of making these attempts. He rather enjoyed it. But whenever he inclined to be sentimental, Ruth would cut him off with some such gravely conceived speech as, Does thee think that thy physician will take advantage of the condition of a man who is as weak as thee is? I will call Alice, if thee has any dying confessions to make. As Philip convalesced, Alice more and more took Ruth's place as his entertainer, and read to him by the hour when he did not want to talk about Ruth, as he did a good deal of the time. Nor was this altogether unsatisfactory to Philip. He was always happy and contented with Alice. She was the most restful person he knew. Better informed than Ruth, and with a much more varied culture, and bright and sympathetic, he was never weary of her company, if he was not greatly excited by it. She had upon his mind that peaceful influence that Mrs. Bolton had when occasionally she sat by his bedside with her work. Some people have this influence, which is like an emanation. They bring peace to a house. They diffuse serene content in a room full of mixed company, though they may say very little, and are apparently unconscious of their own power. Not that Philip did not long for Ruth's presence all the time. Since he was well enough to be about the house, she was busy again with her studies. Now and then her teasing humor came again. She always had a playful shield against his sentiment. Philip used sometimes to declare that she had no sentiment, and then he doubted if he should be pleased with her after all, if she were at all sentimental, and he rejoiced that she had, in such matters, what he called the airy grace of sanity. She was the most gay, serious person he ever saw. Perhaps he was not so much at rest or so contented with her as with Alice, but then he loved her, and what have rest and contentment to do with love? End of chapter 41. This is section 42 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, Chapter 42. Mr. Buckstone's campaign was brief, much briefer than he supposed it would be. He began it purposing to win Laura without being won himself, but his experience was that of all who had fought on that field before him. He diligently continued his effort to win her, but he presently found that while as yet he could not feel entirely certain of having won her, it was very manifest that she had won him. He had made an able fight, brief as it was, and that at least was to his credit. He was in good company now. He walked in a leash of conspicuous captives. These unfortunates followed Laura helplessly, for whenever she took a prisoner, he remained her slave henceforth. Sometimes they chafed in their bondage. Sometimes they tore themselves free and said their serfdom was ended. But sooner or later they always came back, penitent and worshipping. Laura pursued her usual course. She encouraged Mr. Buckstone by turns, and by turns she harassed him. She exalted him to the clouds at one time, and at another she dragged him down again. She constituted him chief champion of the Knobs University bill, and he accepted the position, at first reluctantly, but later as a valued means of serving her. He even came to look upon it as a piece of great good fortune, since it brought him into such frequent contact with her. Through him she learned that the Honorable Mr. Trollope was a bitter enemy of her bill. He urged her not to attempt to influence Mr. Trollope in any way, and explained that whatever she might attempt in that direction would surely be used against her, and with damaging effect. She at first said she knew Mr. Trollope, and was aware that he had a blank, her private figure of speech for brother or son-in-law. But Mr. Buckstone said that he was not able to conceive what so curious a phrase as blank might mean, and had no wish to pry into the matter, since it was probably private. He would nevertheless venture the blind assertion that nothing would answer in this particular case, and during this particular session, but to be exceedingly wary and keep clear away from Mr. Trollope. Any other course would be fatal. It seemed that nothing could be done. Laura was seriously troubled. Everything was looking well, and yet it was plain that one vigorous and determined enemy might eventually succeed in overthrowing all her plans. A suggestion came into her mind presently, and she said, "Can't you fight against his great pension bill, and bring him to terms?" "Oh, never. He and I are sworn brothers on that measure. We work in harness, and are very loving. I do everything I possibly can for him there. But I work with might and main against his immigration bill, as pertinaciously and vindictively, indeed, as he works against our university. We hate each other through half a conversation, and are all affection through the other half. We understand each other. He is an admirable worker outside the Capitol. He will do more for the pension bill than any other man could do. I wish he would make the great speech on it which he wants to make, and then I would make another, and we would be safe." "Well, if he wants to make a great speech, why doesn't he do it?" Visitors interrupted the conversation, and Mr. Buckstone took his leave. It was not of the least moment to Laura that her question had not been answered, inasmuch as it concerned a thing which did not interest her, and yet, human being like, She thought she would have liked to know. An opportunity occurring presently, she put the same question to another person and got an answer that satisfied her. She pondered a good while that night, after she had gone to bed, and when she finally turned over to go to sleep, she had thought out a new scheme. The next evening, at Mrs. Gloverson's party, she said to Mr. Buckstone, "I want Mr. Trollope to make his great speech on the pension bill." "Do you? But you remember I was interrupted, and did not explain to you—"
"Never mind, I know. You must make him make that speech. I very particularly desire it."
"Oh, it is easy to say, 'Make him do it,' but how am I to make him?"
"It is perfectly easy. I have thought it all out."
She then went into the details. At length Mr. Buckstone said, "I see now. I can manage it, I am sure. Indeed, I wonder he never thought of it himself. There are no end of precedents. But how is this going to benefit you after I have managed it? There is where the mystery lies."
"But I will take care of that. It will benefit me a great deal."
"I only wish I could see how. It is the oddest freak. You seem to go the furthest around to get at a thing. But you are in earnest, aren't you?"
"Yes, I am, indeed."
"Very well, I will do it. But why not tell me how you imagine it is going to help you?"
"I will, by and by. Now, there's nobody talking to him. Go straight and do it, there's a good fellow."
A moment or two later the two sworn friends of the pension bill were talking together, earnestly, and seemingly unconscious of the moving throng about them. They talked an hour, and then Mr. Buckstone came back and said, "He hardly fancied it at first, but he fell in love with it after a bit, and we have made a compact, too. I am to keep his secret, and he is to spare me in future when he gets ready to denounce the supporters of the university bill, and I can easily believe he will keep his word on this occasion." A fortnight elapsed, and the university bill had gathered to itself many friends meantime. Senator Dilworthy began to think the harvest was ripe. He conferred with Laura privately. She was able to tell him exactly how the House would vote. There was a majority. The bill would pass, unless weak members got frightened at the last and deserted, a thing pretty likely to occur. The senator said, "I wish we had one more good strong man. Now Trollope ought to be on our side, for he is a friend of the negro, but he is against us, and is our bitterest opponent. If he would simply vote no, but keep quiet and not molest us, I would feel perfectly cheerful and content. But perhaps there is no use in thinking of that."
"Why, I laid a little plan for his benefit 2 weeks ago. I think he will be tractable, maybe. He is to come here tonight."
"Look out for him, my child. He means mischief, sure. It is said that he claims to know of improper practices having been used in the interest of this bill, and he thinks he sees a chance to make a great sensation when the bill comes up. Be wary. Be very, very careful, my dear. Do your very ablest talking now. You can convince a man of anything when you try. You must convince him that if anything improper has been done, you at least are ignorant of it and sorry for it. And if you could only persuade him out of his hostility to the bill, too. But don't overdo the thing. Don't seem too anxious, dear."
"I won't. I'll be ever so careful. I'll talk as sweetly to him as if he were my own child. You may trust me, indeed you may."
The doorbell rang.
"That is the gentleman now,"
said Laura. Senator Dilworthy retired to his study. Laura welcomed Mr. Trollope, a grave, carefully dressed, and very respectable-looking man, with a bald head, standing collar, and old-fashioned watch-seals.
"Promptness is a virtue, Mr. Trollope, and I perceive that you have it. You are always prompt with me."
"I always meet my engagements of every kind, Miss Hawkins."
"It is a quality which is rarer in the world than it has been, I believe. I wish to see you on business, Mr. Trollope."
"I judge so. What can I do for you?"
"You know my bill, the Knobs University bill?"
"Ah, I believe it is your bill. I had forgotten. Yes, I know the bill."
"Well, would you mind telling me your opinion of it?"
"Indeed, since you seem to ask it without reserve, I am obliged to say that I do not regard it favorably. I have not seen the bill itself, but from what I can hear, well, it has a bad look about it.
"Speak it out, never fear."
Well, they say it contemplates a fraud upon the government."
"Well?" said Laura tranquilly.
"Well, I say, well, too.
Well, suppose it were a fraud, which I feel able to deny, would it be the first one?
You take a body's breath away. Did you wish me to vote for it? Was that what you wanted to see me about?
Your instinct is correct. I do want you to vote for it.
Vote for a measure which is generally believed to be at least questionable? I am afraid we cannot come to an understanding, Miss Hawkins.
No, I'm afraid not, if you have resumed your principles, Mr. Trollope.
Did you send for me merely to insult me? It is time for me to take my leave, Miss Hawkins.
No, wait a moment. Don't be offended at a trifle. Do not be offish and unsociable. The steamship subsidy bill was a fraud on the government. You voted for it, Mr. Trollope, though you always opposed the measure until after you had an interview one evening with a certain Mrs. McCarter at her house. She was my agent. She was acting for me. Ah, that is right. Sit down again. You can be sociable easily enough if you have a mind to. Well, I am waiting. Have you nothing to say?
Miss Hawkins, I voted for that bill because when I came to examine into it—
Ah, yes, when you came to examine into it. Well, I only want you to examine into my bill. Mr. Trollope, you would not sell your vote on that subsidy bill, which was perfectly right, but you accepted of some of the stock, with the understanding that it was to stand in your brother-in-law's name.
There is no this is utterly groundless, Miss Hawkins.
But the gentleman seemed somewhat uneasy, nevertheless. Well, not entirely so, perhaps. I and a person whom we will call Miss Blank, never mind the real name, were in a closet at your elbow all the time.
Mr. Trollope winced. Then he said with dignity, Miss Hawkins, is it possible that you were capable of such a thing as that?
It was bad, I confess that. It was bad. Almost as bad as selling one's vote for— but I forget. You did not sell your vote. You only accepted a little trifle, a small token of esteem, for your brother-in-law. Oh, let us come out and be frank with each other. I know you, Mr. Trollope. I have met you on business 3 or 4 times. True, I never offered to corrupt your principles, never hinted such a thing, but always, when I had finished sounding you, I manipulated through an agent. Let us be frank. Wear this comely disguise of virtue before the public. It will count there. But here it is out of place. My dear sir, by and by there's going to be an investigation into that National Internal Improvement Director's relief measure of a few years ago, and you know very well that you will be a crippled man, as likely as not, when it is completed.
It cannot be shown that a man is a knave merely for owning that stock. I am not distressed about the National Improvement Relief Measure.
Oh, indeed, I am not trying to distress you. I only wished to make good my assertion that I knew you. Several of you gentlemen bought of that stock, without paying a penny down, received dividends from it. Think of the happy idea of receiving dividends, and very large ones, too, from stock one hasn't paid for. And all the while your names never appeared in the transaction. If ever you took the stock at all, you took it in other people's names. Now, you see, you had to know one of 2 things, namely, you either knew that the idea of all this preposterous generosity was to bribe you into future legislative friendship, or you didn't know it. That is to say, you had to be either a knave or a fool. There was no middle ground. You are not a fool, Mr. Trollope.
Miss Hawkins, you flatter me. But seriously, you do not forget that some of the best and purest men in Congress took that stock in that way.
Did Senator Blank?
Well, no, I believe not.
Of course you believe not. Do you suppose he was ever approached on the subject?
Perhaps not.
If you had approached him, for instance, fortified with the fact that some of the best men in Congress, and the purest, etc., etc., what would have been the result?
Well, what would have been the result?
He would have shown you the door. For Mr. Blank is neither a knave nor a fool. There are other men in the Senate and the House whom no one would have been hardy enough to approach with that relief stock in that peculiarly generous way, but they are not of the class that you regard as the best and purest. No, I say I know you, Mr. Trollope. That is to say, one may suggest a thing to Mr. Trollope which it would not do to suggest to Mr. Blank. Mr. Trollope, you are pledged to support the indigent congressman's retroactive appropriation, which is to come up either in this or the next session. You do not deny that, even in public. The man that will vote for that bill will break the 8th commandment in any other way, sir."
"But he will not vote for your corrupt measure, nevertheless, madam," exclaimed Mr. Trollope, rising from his seat in passion.
"Ah, but he will. Sit down again, and let me explain why. Oh, come, don't behave so. It is very unpleasant. Now, be good, and you shall have the missing page of your great speech. Here it is," and she displayed a sheet of manuscript. Mr. Trollope turned immediately back from the threshold. It might have been gladness that flashed into his face. It might have been something else, but at any rate there was much astonishment mixed with it.
"Good. Where did you get it? Give it me."
"Now, there is no hurry. Sit down. Sit down, and let us talk and be friendly."
The gentleman wavered. Then he said, "No, this is only a subterfuge. I will go. It is not the missing page."
Laura tore off a couple of lines from the bottom of the sheet. "Now," she said, "you will know whether this is the handwriting or not. You know it is the handwriting. Now, if you will listen, you will know that this must be the list of statistics which was to be the nub of your great effort, and the accompanying blast the beginning of the burst of eloquence which was continued on the next page, and you will recognize that there was where you broke down."
She read the page. Mr. Trollope said, "This is perfectly astounding. Still, what is all this to me? It is nothing. It does not concern me. The speech is made, and there an end. I did break down for a moment, and in a rather uncomfortable place, since I had led up to those statistics with some grandeur. The hiatus was pleasanter to the House and the galleries than it was to me. But it is no matter now. A week has passed. The jests about it ceased 3 or 4 days ago. The whole thing is a matter of indifference to me, Miss Hawkins."
"But you apologized, and promised the statistics for next day. Why didn't you keep your promise?"
"The matter was not of sufficient consequence. The time was gone by to produce an effect with them."
"But I hear that other friends of the Soldiers' Pension Bill desire them very much. I think you ought to let them have them."
"Miss Hawkins, this silly blunder of my copyist evidently has more interest for you than it has for me. I will send my private secretary to you, and let him discuss the subject with you at length."
"Did he copy your speech for you?"
"Of course he did. Why all these questions? Tell me, how did you get hold of that page of manuscript? That is the only thing that stirs a passing interest in my mind."
"I'm coming to that."
Then she said, much as if she were talking to herself,
"It does not seem like taking a deal of unnecessary pains for a body to hire another body to construct a great speech for him, and then go and get still another body to copy it before it can be read in the House."
"Miss Hawkins, what do you mean by such talk as that?"
"Why, I am sure I mean no harm to anybody in the world. I am certain that I overheard the Honorable Mr. Buckstone either promise to write your great speech for you, or else get some other competent person to do it."
"Well, this is perfectly absurd, madam, perfectly absurd!"
And Mr. Trollope affected a laugh of derision. "Why, the thing has occurred before now. I mean that I have heard that congressmen have sometimes hired literary grubs to build speeches for them. Now, didn't I overhear a conversation like that I spoke of?"
"Pshaw! Why, of course you may have heard some such jesting nonsense. But would one be in earnest about so farcical a thing?"
"Well, if it was only a joke, why did you make a serious matter of it? Why did you get the speech written for you, and then read it in the House without ever having it copied?"
Mr. Trollope did not laugh this time. He seemed seriously perplexed. He said, "Come, play out your jest, Miss Hawkins. I can't understand what you are contriving, but it seems to entertain you, so please go on."
"I will, I assure you, but I hope to make the matter entertaining to you, too. Your private secretary never copied your speech."
"Indeed? Really, you seem to know my affairs better than I do myself."
"I believe I do. You can't name your own amanuensis, Mr. Trollope."
"That is sad, indeed. Perhaps Miss Hawkins can?"
"Yes, I can. I wrote your speech myself, and you read it from my manuscript. There, now."
Mr. Trollope did not spring to his feet and smite his brow with his hand while a cold sweat broke out all over him, and the color forsook his face. No, he only said, "Good God!" and looked greatly astonished.
Laura handed him her commonplace book and called his attention to the fact that the handwriting there and the handwriting of this speech were the same. He was shortly convinced. He laid the book aside and said composedly, "Well, the wonderful tragedy is done, and it transpires that I am indebted to you for my late eloquence. What of it? What was all this for, and what does it amount to, after all? What do you propose to do about it?"
"Oh, nothing. It is only a bit of pleasantry. When I overheard that conversation I took an early opportunity to ask Mr. Buckstone if he knew of anybody who might want a speech written. I had a friend, and so on and so on. I was the friend myself. I thought I might do you a good turn then, and depend on you to do me one by and by. I never let Mr. Buckstone have the speech till the last moment, and when you hurried off to the house with it, you did not know there was a missing page, of course, but I did."
"And now perhaps you think that if I refuse to support your bill you will make a grand exposure?"
"Well, I had not thought of that. I only kept back the page for the mere fun of the thing, but since you mention it, I don't know but I might do something if I were angry."
"My dear Miss Hawkins, if you were to give out that you composed my speech, you know very well that people would say it was only your raillery, your fondness for putting a victim in the pillory and amusing the public at his expense. It is too flimsy, Miss Hawkins, for a person of your fine inventive talent. Contrive an abler device than that. Come."
"It is easily done, Mr. Trollope. I will hire a man and pin this page on his breast and label it, 'The Missing Fragment of the Honorable Mr. Trollope's Great Speech, which speech was written and composed by Miss Laura Hawkins under a secret understanding for $100, and the money has not been paid.' And I will pin round about it notes in my handwriting, which I will procure from prominent friends of mine for the occasion. Also your printed speech in the Globe, showing the connection between its bracketed hiatus and my fragment. And I give you my word of honor that I will stand that human bulletin board in the rotunda of the Capitol and make him stay there a week. You see, you are premature, Mr. Trollope. The wonderful tragedy is not done yet, by any means. Come now. Doesn't it improve?"
Mr. Trollope opened his eyes rather widely at this novel aspect of the case. He got up and walked the floor and gave himself a moment for reflection. Then he stopped and studied Laura's face a while, and ended by saying, "Well, I am obliged to believe you would be reckless enough to do that."
"Then don't put me to the test, Mr. Trollope, but let's drop the matter. I have had my joke, and you've borne the infliction becomingly enough. It spoils a jest to harp on it after one has had one's laugh. I would much rather talk about my bill."
"So would I, now, my clandestine amanuensis. Compared with some other subjects, even your bill is a pleasant topic to discuss."
"Very good indeed. I thought I could persuade you. Now I am sure you will be generous to the poor negro and vote for that bill."
"Yes, I feel more tenderly toward the oppressed colored man than I did. Shall we bury the hatchet and be good friends and respect each other's little secrets on condition that I vote aye on the measure?"
"With all my heart, Mr. Trollope. I give you my word of that."
"It is a bargain. But isn't there something else you could give me, too?"
Laura looked at him inquiringly a moment, and then she comprehended.
"Oh, yes. You may have it now. I haven't any more use for it."
She picked up the page of manuscript, but she reconsidered her intention of handing it to him, and said,
"But never mind. I will keep it close. No one shall see it. You shall have it as soon as your vote is recorded."
Mr. Trollope looked disappointed, but presently made his adieu, and had got as far as the hall when something occurred to Laura. She said to herself,
"I don't simply want his vote under compulsion. He might vote aye, but work against the bill in secret for revenge. That man is unscrupulous enough to do anything. I must have his hearty cooperation as well as his vote. There's only one way to get that."
She called him back and said,
"I value your vote, Mr. Trollope, but I value your influence more. You are able to help a measure along in many ways if you choose. I want to ask you to work for the bill as well as vote for it."
"It takes so much of one's time, Miss Hawkins, and time is money, you know."
"Yes, I know it is, especially in Congress. Now, there is no use in you and I dealing in pretenses and going at matters in roundabout ways. We know each other. Disguises are nonsense. Let us be plain. I will make it an object to you to work for the bill."
Don't make it unnecessarily plain, please. There are little priorities that are best preserved. What do you propose?"
"Well, this." She mentioned the names of several prominent congressmen. "Now," she said, "these gentlemen are to vote and work for the bill simply out of love for the negro, and out of pure generosity I have put in a relative of each as a member of the university incorporation. They will handle $1 million or so of money officially, but will receive no salaries. A larger number of statesmen are to vote and work for the bill, also out of love for the negro, gentlemen of but moderate influence these, and out of pure generosity I am to see that relatives of theirs have positions in the university, with salaries, and good ones too. You will vote and work for the bill, from mere affection for the negro, and I desire to testify my gratitude becomingly. Make free choice. Have you any friend whom you would like to present with a salaried or unsalaried position in our institution?"
"Well, I have a brother-in-law."
"That same old brother-in-law, you good unselfish provider. I have heard of him often, through my agents. How regularly he does turn up, to be sure. He could deal with those millions virtuously, and withal with ability, too. But of course you would rather he had a salaried position?"
"Oh, no," said the gentleman facetiously. "We are very humble in our desires. We want no money. We labor solely for our country, and require no reward but the luxury of an applauding conscience. Make him one of those poor, hard-working, unsalaried corporators, and let him do everybody good with those millions, and go hungry himself. I will try to exert a little influence in favor of the bill."
Arrived at home, Mr. Trollope sat down and thought it all over. Something after this fashion: "It is about the shape it might have taken if he had spoken it aloud."
"My reputation is getting a little damaged, and I meant to clear it up brilliantly with an exposure of this bill at the supreme moment, and ride back into Congress on the éclat of it, and if I had that bit of manuscript I would do it yet. It would be more money in my pocket in the end than my brother-in-law will get out of that incorporatorship, fat as it is. But that sheet of paper is out of my reach. She will never let that get out of her hands. And what a mountain it is! It blocks up my road completely. She was going to hand it to me, once. Why didn't she? Must be a deep woman. Deep devil. That is what she is, a beautiful devil, and perfectly fearless, too. The idea of her pinning that paper on a man and standing him up in the rotunda looks absurd at first glance. But she would do it. She is capable of doing anything. I went there hoping she would try to bribe me. Good solid capital that would be in the exposure. Well, my prayer was answered. She did try to bribe me, and I made the best of a bad bargain and let her. I am checkmated. I must contrive something fresh to get back to Congress on. Very well, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. I will work for the bill. The incorporatorship will be a very good thing."
As soon as Mr. Trollope had taken his leave, Laura ran to Senator Dilworthy and began to speak, but he interrupted her and said distressfully, without even turning from his writing to look at her,
"Only a half-hour? You gave it up early, child. However, it was best. I'm sure it was best, and safest."
"Give it up? I?" The senator sprang up all aglow.
"My child, you can't mean that you—"
"I've made him promise on honor to think about a compromise tonight, and come and tell me his decision in the morning."
"Good. There's hope yet that—"
"Nonsense, uncle. I've made him engage to let the Tennessee Land Bill utterly alone."
"Impossible. You—"
"I've made him promise to vote with us."
"Incredible!
"I've made him swear that he'll work for us."
"Preposterous! Utterly Break a window, child, before I suffocate."
"No matter, it's true anyway. Now we can march into Congress with drums beating and colors flying."
Well, well, well. I'm sadly bewildered. Sadly bewildered. I can't understand it at all. The most extraordinary woman that ever— It's a great day. It's a great day. There, let me put my hand in benediction on this precious head. Ah, my child, the poor negro will bless—
"Oh, bother the poor negro, uncle. Put it in your speech. Good night. Good-bye. We'll marshal our forces and March with the dawn." Laura reflected a while, when she was alone, and then fell to laughing peacefully. "Everybody works for me," so ran her thought. It was a good idea to make Buckstone lead Mr. Trollope on to get a great speech written for him, and it was a happy part of the same idea for me to copy the speech after Mr. Buckstone had written it, and then keep back a page. Mr. B. was very complimentary to me when Trollope's breakdown in the house showed him the object of my mysterious scheme. I think he will say still finer things when I tell him the triumph the sequel to it has gained for us. But what a coward the man was, to believe I would have exposed that page in the rotunda, and so exposed myself. However, I don't know. I will think a moment. Suppose he voted no, suppose the bill failed. That is to suppose this stupendous game lost forever, that I have played so desperately for. Suppose people came around pitying me, odious, and he could have saved me by his single voice. Yes, I would have exposed him. What would I care for the talk that would have made about me, when I was gone to Europe with Selby, and all the world was busy with my history and my dishonor? It would be almost happiness to spite somebody at such a time. End of chapter 42. This is section 43 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner. Chapter 43. The very next day, sure enough, the campaign opened. In due course, the Speaker of the House reached that order of business which is termed notices of bills, and then the Honorable Mr. Buckstone rose in his place and gave notice of a bill to found and incorporate the Knobs Industrial University, and then sat down without saying anything further. The busy gentlemen in the reporters' gallery jotted a line in their notebooks, ran to the telegraphic desk in a room which communicated with their own writing parlor, and then hurried back to their places in the gallery. And by the time they had resumed their seats, the line which they had delivered to the operator had been read in telegraphic offices in towns and cities hundreds of miles away. It was distinguished by frankness of language as well as by brevity. "The child is born. Buckstone gives notice of the thieving Knobs University job. It is said the noses have been counted, and enough votes have been bought to pass it." For some time the correspondents had been posting their several journals upon the alleged disreputable nature of the bill, and furnishing daily reports of the Washington gossip concerning it. So the next morning nearly every newspaper of character in the land assailed the measure and hurled broadsides of invective at Mr. Buckstone. The Washington papers were more respectful, as usual, and conciliatory, also as usual. They generally supported measures when it was possible, but when they could not, they deprecated violent expressions of opinion in other journalistic quarters. They always deprecated when there was trouble ahead. However, the Washington Daily Love Feast hailed the bill with warm approbation. This was Senator Balaam's paper, or rather Brother Balaam, as he was popularly called, for he had been a clergyman in his day, and he himself and all that he did still emitted an odor of sanctity now that he had diverged into journalism and politics. He was a power in the congressional prayer meeting, and in all movements that looked to the spread of religion and temperance. His paper supported the new bill with gushing affection. It was a noble measure, it was a just measure, it was a generous measure, it was a pure measure, and that surely should recommend it in these corrupt times. And finally, if the nature of the bill were not known at all, the love feast would support it anyway, and unhesitatingly, for the fact that Senator Dilworthy was the originator of the measure was a guarantee that it contemplated a worthy and righteous work. Senator Dilworthy was so anxious to know what the New York papers would say about the bill that he had arranged to have synopses of their editorials telegraphed to him. He could not wait for the papers themselves to crawl along down to Washington by a mail train which has never run over a cow since the road was built, for the reason that it has never been able to overtake one. It carries the usual cow-catcher in front of the locomotive, but this is
mere ostentation. It ought to be attached to the rear car, where it could do some good. But instead, no provision is made there for the protection of the traveling public, and hence it is not a matter of surprise that cows so frequently climb aboard that train and among the passengers. The senator read his dispatches aloud at the breakfast table. Laura was troubled beyond measure at their tone, and said that that sort of comment would defeat the bill. But the senator said, "Oh, not at all, my child. It is just what we want. Persecution is the one thing needful now. All the other forces are secured. Give us newspaper persecution enough, and we are safe. Vigorous persecution will alone carry a bill sometimes, dear. And when you start with a strong vote in the first place, persecution comes in with double effect. It scares off some of the weak supporters, true, but it soon turns strong ones into stubborn ones, and then, presently, it changes the tide of public opinion. The great public is weak-minded. The great public is sentimental. The great public always turns around and weeps for an odious murderer, and prays for him, and carries flowers to his prison, and beseeches the governor with appeals to his clemency, as soon as the papers begin to howl for that man's blood. In a word, the great putty-hearted public loves to gush, and there is no such darling opportunity to gush as a case of persecution affords."
"Well, uncle dear, if your theory is right, let us go into raptures, for nobody can ask a heartier persecution than these editorials are furnishing."
"I am not so sure of that, my daughter. I don't entirely like the tone of some of these remarks. They lack vim, they lack venom. Here is one calls it a questionable measure. Bah! There is no strength in that. This one is better. It calls it highway robbery. That sounds something like. But now this one seems satisfied to call it an iniquitous scheme. Iniquitous does not exasperate anybody. It is weak, puerile. The ignorant will imagine it to be intended for a compliment. But this other one, the one I read last, has the true ring. This vile, dirty effort to rob the public treasury by the kites and vultures that now infest the filthy den called Congress, that is admirable, admirable. We must have more of that sort. But it will come, no fear of that. They're not warmed up yet. A week from now you'll see.
"Uncle, you and Brother Balaam are bosom friends. Why don't you get his paper to persecute us, too?"
"It isn't worth while, my daughter. His support doesn't hurt a bill. Nobody reads his editorials but himself. But I wish the New York papers would talk a little plainer. It is annoying to have to wait a week for them to warm up. I expected better things at their hands, and time is precious now." At the proper hour, according to his previous notice, Mr. Buckstone duly introduced his bill entitled, "An Act to Found and Incorporate the Knobs Industrial University," moved its proper reference, and sat down. The Speaker of the House rattled off this observation: "Now Jackson bill takes them consequences so referred." Habitues of the House comprehend that this long lightning-heeled word signified that if there was no objection the bill would take the customary course of a measure of its nature and be referred to the Committee on Benevolent Appropriations, and that it was accordingly so referred. Strangers merely supposed that the Speaker was taking a gargle for some affection of the throat. The reporters immediately telegraphed the introduction of the bill, and they added, "The assertion that the bill will pass was premature. It is said that many favorers of it will desert when the storm breaks upon them from the public press." The storm came, and during 10 days it waxed more and more violent day by day. The great Negro University swindle became the one absorbing topic of conversation throughout the Union. Individuals denounced it, journals denounced it, public meetings denounced it. The pictorial papers caricatured its friends. The whole nation seemed to be growing frantic over it. Meantime, the Washington correspondents were sending such telegrams as these abroad in the land, under date of Saturday: "Congressmen Jex and Fluke are wavering. It is believed they will desert the execrable bill." Monday: "Jex and Fluke have deserted." Thursday:
Tubbs and Huffy left the sinking ship last night. Later on, 3 desertions. The university thieves are getting scared, though they will not own it. Later, the leaders are growing stubborn. They swear they can carry it, but it is now almost certain that they no longer have a majority. After a day or two of reluctant and ambiguous telegrams, public sentiment seems changing, a trifle in favor of the bill, but only a trifle. And still later, it is whispered that the Honorable Mr. Trollope has gone over to the pirates. It is probably a canard. Mr. Trollope has all along been the bravest and most efficient champion of virtue and the people against the bill, and the report is without doubt a shameless invention. Next day, with characteristic treachery, the truckling and pusillanimous reptile, crippled speech Trollope, has gone over to the enemy. It is contended now that he has been a friend to the bill in secret since the day it was introduced, and has had bankable reasons for being so, but he himself declares that he has gone over because the malignant persecution of the bill by the newspapers caused him to study its provisions with more care than he had previously done, and this close examination revealed the fact that the measure is one in every way worthy of support. Pretty thin. It cannot be denied that this desertion has had a damaging effect. Jex and Fluke have returned to their iniquitous allegiance, with 6 or 8 others of lesser caliber, and it is reported and believed that Tubbs and Huffy are ready to go back. It is feared that the university swindle is stronger today than it has ever been before. Later, midnight, it is said that the committee will report the bill back tomorrow. Both sides are marshaling their forces, and the fight on this bill is evidently going to be the hottest of the session. All Washington is boiling. End of chapter 43.
This is section 44 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, chapter 44. "It's easy enough for another fellow to talk," said Harry, despondingly, after he had put Philip in possession of his view of the case. "It's easy enough to say, 'Give her up, if you don't care for her.' What am I going to do to give her up?" It seemed to Harry that it was a situation requiring some active measures. He couldn't realize that he had fallen hopelessly in love without some rights accruing to him for the possession of the object of his passion. Quiet resignation under relinquishment of anything he wanted was not in his line, and when it appeared to him that his surrender of Laura would be the withdrawal of the one barrier that kept her from ruin, it was unreasonable to expect that he could see how to give her up. Harry had the most buoyant confidence in his own project always. He saw everything connected with himself in a large way and in rosy lines. This predominance of the imagination over the judgment gave that appearance of exaggeration to his conversation and to his communications with regard to himself, which sometimes conveyed the impression that he was not speaking the truth. His acquaintances had been known to say that they invariably allowed a half for shrinkage in his statements, and held the other half under advisement for confirmation. Philip, in this case, could not tell from Harry's story exactly how much encouragement Laura had given him, nor what hopes he might justly have of winning her. He had never seen him desponding before. The brag appeared to be all taken out of him, and his airy manner only asserted itself now and then in a comical imitation of its old self. Philip wanted time to look about him before he decided what to do. He was not familiar with Washington, and it was difficult to adjust his feelings and perceptions to its peculiarities. Coming out of the sweet sanity of the Bolton household, this was by contrast the maddest Vanity Fair one could conceive. It seemed to him a feverish, unhealthy atmosphere in which lunacy would be easily developed. He fancied that everybody attached to himself an exaggerated importance, from the fact of being at the national capital, the center of political influence, the fountain of patronage, preferment, jobs, and opportunities. People were introduced to each other as from this or that state, not from cities or towns, and this gave a largeness to their representative feeling. All the women talked politics as naturally and glibly as they talk fashion or literature elsewhere. There was always some exciting topic at the Capitol, or some huge slander was rising up like a miasmic exhalation from the Potomac, threatening to settle no one knew exactly where. Every other person was an aspirant for a place, or, if he had one, for a better place, or more pay. Almost every other one had some claim or interest or remedy to urge. Even the women were all advocates for the advancement of some person, and they violently espoused or denounced this or that measure, as it would affect some relative, acquaintance, or friend. Love, travel, even death itself waited on the chances of the dies daily thrown in the two houses and the committee rooms there. If the measure went through, love could afford to ripen into marriage, and longing for foreign travel would have fruition, and it must have been only eternal hope springing in the breast that kept alive numerous old claimants, who for years and years had besieged the doors of Congress, and who looked as if they needed not so much an appropriation of money as 6 feet of ground. And those who stood so long waiting for success to bring them death were usually those who had a just claim. Representing states and talking of national and even international affairs as familiarly as neighbors at home talk of poor crops and the extravagance of their ministers, was likely at first to impose upon Philip as to the importance of the people gathered here. There was a little newspaper editor from Phil's native town, the assistant on a Pendletonian weekly, who made his little annual joke about the first egg laid on our table, and who was the menial of every tradesman in the village, and under bonds to him for frequent puffs, except the undertaker, about whose employment he was recklessly facetious. In Washington he was an important man, correspondent and clerk of 2 House committees, a worker in politics, and a confident critic of every woman and every man in Washington. He would be a consul, no doubt, by and by, at some foreign port of the language of which he was ignorant, though if ignorance of language were a qualification he might have been a consul at home. His easy familiarity with great men was beautiful to see, and when Philip learned what a tremendous underground influence this little ignoramus had, he no longer wondered at the queer appointments and the queerer legislation. Philip was not long in discovering that people in Washington did not differ much from other people. They had the same meanness, generosities, and tastes. A Washington boarding-house had the odor of a boarding-house the world over. Colonel Sellers was as unchanged as anyone Philip saw, whom he had known elsewhere. Washington appeared to be the native element of this man. His pretensions were equal to any he encountered there. He saw nothing in its society that equaled that of Hawkeye. He sat down to no table that could not be unfavorably contrasted with his own at home. The most airy scheme inflated in the hot air of the Capitol only reached in magnitude some of his lesser fancies, the byplay of his constructive imagination. "The country is getting along very well," he said to Philip, "but our public men are too timid. What we want is more money. I've told Boutwell so. Talk about basing the currency on gold. You might as well base it on pork. Gold is only one product. Base it on everything. You've got to do something for the West. How am I to move my crops? We must have improvements. Grant's got the idea. We want a canal from the James River to the Mississippi. Government ought to build it." It was difficult to get the colonel off from these large themes when he was once started, but Philip brought the conversation round to Laura and her reputation in the city. "No," he said, "I haven't noticed much. We've been so busy about this university. It will make Laura rich with the rest of us, and she has done nearly as much as if she were a man. She has great talent, and will make a big match. I see the foreign ministers and that sort after her. Yes, there is talk, always will be, about a pretty woman so much in public as she is. Tough stories come to me, but I put 'em away. 'Tain't likely one of Si Hawkins' children would do that, for she is the same as a child of his. I told her, though, to go slow," added the colonel, as if that mysterious admonition from him would set everything right. Do you know anything about a Colonel Selby?"
"Know all about him. Fine fellow. But he's got a wife, and I told him as a friend he'd better sheer off from Laura. I reckon he thought better of it and did."
But Philip was not long in learning the truth. Courted as Laura was by a certain class, and still admitted into society, that nevertheless buzzed with disreputable stories about her, she had lost character with the best people. Her intimacy with Selby was open gossip, and there were winks and thrustings of the tongue in any group of men when she passed by. It was clear enough that Harry's delusion must be broken up, and that no such feeble obstacle as his passion could interpose would turn Laura from her fate. Philip determined to see her, and put himself in possession of the truth, as he suspected it, in order to show Harry his folly. Laura, after her last conversation with Harry, had a new sense of her position. She had noticed, before the signs of a change in manner towards her, a little less respect perhaps from men, and an avoidance by women. She had attributed this latter partly to jealousy of her, for no one is willing to acknowledge a fault in himself when a more agreeable motive can be found for the estrangement of his acquaintances. But now, if society had turned on her, she would defy it. It was not in her nature to shrink. She knew she had been wronged, and she knew that she had no remedy. What she heard of Colonel Selby's proposed departure alarmed her more than anything else, and she calmly determined that if he was deceiving her the second time, it should be the last. Let society finish the tragedy if it liked. She was indifferent what came after. At the first opportunity she charged Selby with his intention to abandon her. He unblushingly denied it. He had not thought of going to Europe. He had only been amusing himself with Sellers' schemes. He swore that as soon as she succeeded with her bill, he would fly with her to any part of the world. She did not quite believe him, for she saw that he feared her, and she began to suspect that his were the protestations of a coward to gain time. But she showed him no doubts. She only watched his movements day by day, and always held herself ready to act promptly. When Philip came into the presence of this attractive woman, he could not realize that she was the subject of all the scandal he had heard. She received him with quite the old Hawkeye openness and cordiality, and fell to talking at once of their little acquaintance there, and it seemed impossible that he could ever say to her what he had come determined to say. Such a man as Philip has only one standard by which to judge women. Laura recognized that fact, no doubt. The better part of her woman's nature saw it. Such a man might, years ago, not now, have changed her nature, and made the issue of her life so different, even after her cruel abandonment. She had a dim feeling of this, and she would like now to stand well with him. The spark of truth and honor that was left in her was elicited by his presence. It was this influence that governed her conduct in this interview. "I have come," said Philip, in his direct manner, "from my friend Mr. Brierly. You are not ignorant of his feelings towards you?"
"Perhaps not."
"But perhaps you do not know, you who have so much admiration, how sincere and overmastering his love is for you."
Philip would not have spoken so plainly if he had in mind anything except to draw from Laura something that would end Harry's passion.
"And is sincere love so rare, Mr. Sterling?"
asked Laura, moving her foot a little, and speaking with a shade of sarcasm.
"Perhaps not in Washington," replied Philip, tempted into a similar tone. "Excuse my bluntness," he continued, "but would the knowledge of his love, would his devotion, make any difference to you in your Washington life?"
"In respect to what?"
asked Laura quickly.
"Well, to others. I won't equivocate. To Colonel Selby."
Laura's face flushed with anger or shame. She looked steadily at Philip and began,
"But what right, sir—"
"By the right of friendship," interrupted Philip stoutly. "It may matter little to you. It is everything to him. He has a quixotic notion that you would turn back from what is before you for his sake. You cannot be ignorant of what all the city is talking of."
Philip said this determinedly and with some bitterness. It was a full minute before Laura spoke. Both had risen, Philip as if to go, and Laura in suppressed excitement. When she spoke, her voice was very unsteady, and she looked down.
"Yes, I know. I perfectly understand what you mean. Mr. Brierly is nothing, simply nothing. He is a moth
Singed, that is all. The trifler with women thought he was a wasp. I have no pity for him, not the least. You may tell him not to make a fool of himself, and to keep away. I say this on your account, not his. You are not like him. It is enough for me that you want it so. Mr. Sterling," she continued, looking up, and there were tears in her eyes that contradicted the hardness of her language, "you might not pity him if you knew my history. Perhaps you would not wonder at some things you hear. No, it is useless to ask me why it must be so. You can't make a life over. Society wouldn't let you if you would, and mine must be lived as it is. There, sir. I am not offended, but it is useless for you to say anything more." Philip went away with his heart lightened about Harry, but profoundly saddened by the glimpse of what this woman might have been. He told Harry all that was necessary of the conversation. She was bent on going her own way. He had not the ghost of a chance. He was a fool, she had said, for thinking he had. And Harry accepted it meekly, and made up his own mind that Philip didn't know much about women. End of chapter 44. This is section 45 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner. Chapter 45. The galleries of the House were packed on the momentous day, not because the reporting of an important bill back by a committee was a thing to be excited about. If the bill were going to take the ordinary course afterward, it would be like getting excited over the impaneling of a coroner's jury in a murder case instead of saving up one's emotions for the grander occasion of the hanging of the accused 2 years later, after all the tedious forms of law had been gone through with. But suppose you understand that this coroner's jury is going to turn out to be a vigilance committee in disguise, who will hear testimony for an hour, and then hang the murderer on the spot. That puts a different aspect upon the matter. Now it was whispered that the legitimate forms of procedure usual in the House, and which keep a bill hanging along for days and even weeks before it is finally passed upon, were going to be overruled in this case, and a short work made of the measure. And so what was beginning as a mere inquest might turn out to be something very different. In the course of the day's business, the order of reports of committees was finally reached, and when the weary crowds heard that glad announcement issue from the speaker's lips, they ceased to fret at the dragging delay, and plucked up spirit. The chairman of the Committee on Benevolent Appropriations rose and made his report, and just then a blue-uniformed, brass-mounted little page put a note into his hand. It was from Senator Dilworthy, who had appeared upon the floor of the House for a moment and flitted away again. "Everybody expects a grand assault in force. No doubt you believe, as I certainly do, that it is the thing to do. We are strong, and everything is hot for the contest. Trollope's espousal of our cause has immensely helped us, and we grow in power constantly. 10 of the opposition were called away from town about noon, but, so it is said, only for 1 day. 6 others are sick, but expect to be about again tomorrow or next day, a friend tells me. A bold onslaught is worth trying. Go for a suspension of the rules. You will find we can swing a 2/3 vote. I am perfectly satisfied of it. The Lord's truth will prevail. Dilworthy." Mr. Buckstone had reported the bills from his committee, one by one, leaving the bill to the last. When the House had voted upon the acceptance or rejection of the report upon all but it, and the question now being upon its disposal, Mr. Buckstone begged that the House would give its attention to a few remarks which he desired to make. His committee had instructed him to report the bill favorably. He wished to explain the nature of the measure, and thus justify the committee's action. The hostility roused by the press would then disappear, and the bill would shine forth in its true and noble character. He said that its provisions were simple. It incorporated the Knobs Industrial University, locating it in East Tennessee, declaring it open to all persons without distinction of sex, color, or religion, and committing its management to a board of perpetual trustees, with power to fill vacancies in their own number. It provided for the erection of certain buildings for the university, dormitories, lecture halls, museums, libraries, laboratories, workshops, furnaces, and mills.
It provided also for the purchase of 65,000 acres of land, fully described, for the purposes of the university, in the Knobs of East Tennessee, and it appropriated $dollars for the purchase of the land, which should be the property of the national trustees in trust for the uses named. Every effort had been made to secure the refusal of the whole amount of the property of the Hawkins heirs in the Knobs, some 75,000 acres, Mr. Buckstone said, but Mr. Washington Hawkins, one of the heirs, objected. He was, indeed, very reluctant to sell any part of the land at any price, and indeed this reluctance was justifiable when one considers how constantly and how greatly the property is rising in value. What the South needed, continued Mr. Buckstone, was skilled labor. Without that it would be unable to develop its mines, build its roads, work to advantage and without great waste its fruitful land, establish manufacturers, or enter upon a prosperous industrial career. Its laborers were almost altogether unskilled. Change them into intelligent, trained workmen, and you increased at once the capital, the resources of the entire South, which would enter upon a prosperity hitherto unknown. In 5 years the increase in local wealth would not only reimburse the government for the outlay in this appropriation, but pour untold wealth into the treasury. This was the material view, and the least important in the honorable gentleman's opinion. Here he referred to some notes furnished him by Senator Dilworthy, and then continued, God had given us the care of these colored millions. What account should we render to him of our stewardship? We had made them free. Should we leave them ignorant? We had cast them upon their own resources. Should we leave them without tools? We could not tell what the intentions of Providence are in regard to these peculiar people, but our duty was plain. The Knobs Industrial University would be a vast school of modern science and practice, worthy of a great nation. It would combine the advantages of Zurich, Freiburg, Creusot, and Sheffield Scientific. Providence had apparently reserved and set apart the Knobs of East Tennessee for this purpose. What else were they for? Was it not wonderful that for more than 30 years, over a generation, the choicest portion of them had remained in one family, untouched, as if separated for some great use? It might be asked why the government should buy this land, when it had millions of acres, more than the railroad companies desired, which it might devote to this purpose. He answered that the government had no such tract of land as this. It had nothing comparable to it for the purposes of the university. This was to be a school of mining, of engineering, of the working of metals, of chemistry, zoology, botany, manufactures, agriculture, in short, of all the complicated industries that make a state great. There was no place for the location of such a school like the Knobs of East Tennessee. The hills abounded in metals of all sorts, iron in all its combinations, copper, bismuth, gold and silver in small quantities, platinum, he believed, tin, aluminum. It was covered with forests and strange plants. In the woods were found the coon, the opossum, the fox, the deer, and many other animals who roamed in the domain of natural history. Coal existed in enormous quantity, and no doubt oil. It was such a place for the practice of agricultural experiments that any student who had been successful there would have an easy task in any other portion of the country. No place offered equal facilities for experiments in mining, metallurgy, engineering. He expected to live to see the day when the youth of the South would resort to its mines, its workshops, its laboratories, its furnaces and factories for practical instruction in all the great industrial pursuits. A noisy and rather ill-natured debate followed now, and lasted hour after hour. The friends of the bill were instructed by the leaders to make no effort to check it. It was deemed better strategy to tire out the opposition. It was decided to vote down every proposition to adjourn, and so continue the sitting into the night. Opponents might desert then, one by one, and weaken their party, for they had no personal stake in the bill. Sunset came, and still the fight went on. The gas was lit, the crowd in the galleries began to thin, but the contest continued. The crowd returned by and by, with hunger and thirst appeased, and aggravated the hungry and thirsty House by looking contented and comfortable. but still the wrangle lost nothing of its bitterness. Recesses were moved plaintively by the opposition, and invariably voted down by the university army. At midnight the House presented a spectacle calculated to interest a stranger. The great galleries were still thronged, though only with men now. The bright colors that had made them look like hanging gardens were gone with the ladies. The reporters' gallery was merely occupied by one or two watchful sentinels of the quill-driving guild. The main body cared nothing for a debate that had dwindled to a mere vaporing of dull speakers, and now and then a brief quarrel over a point of order. But there was an unusually large attendance of journalists in the reporters' waiting-room, chatting, smoking, and keeping on the qui vive for the general eruption of the congressional volcano that must come when the time was ripe for it. Senator Dilworthy and Philip were in the diplomatic gallery. Washington sat in the public gallery, and Colonel Sellers was not far away. The colonel had been flying about the corridors and buttonholding congressmen all the evening, and believed that he had accomplished a world of valuable service, but fatigue was telling upon him now, and he was quiet and speechless for once. Below, a few senators lounged upon the sofas set apart for visitors, and talked with idle congressmen. A dreary member was speaking. The presiding officer was nodding. Here and there little knots of members stood in the aisles, whispering together. All about the House others sat in all the various attitudes that express weariness. Some, tilted back, had one or more legs disposed upon their desks. Some sharpened pencils indolently. Some scribbled aimlessly. Some yawned and stretched. A great many lay upon their breasts upon the desks, sound asleep and gently snoring. The flooding gaslight from the fancifully wrought roof poured down upon the tranquil scene. Hardly a sound disturbed the stillness, save the monotonous eloquence of the gentleman who occupied the floor. Now and then a warrior of the opposition broke down under the pressure, gave it up, and went home. Mr. Buckstone began to think it might be safe now to proceed to business. He consulted with Trollope and one or two others. Senator Dilworthy descended to the floor of the House, and they went to meet him. After a brief comparison of notes, the congressmen sought their seats and sent pages about the House with messages to friends. These latter instantly roused up, yawned, and began to look alert. The moment the floor was unoccupied, Mr. Buckstone rose, with an injured look, and said it was evident that the opponents of the bill were merely talking against time, hoping in this unbecoming way to tire out the friends of the measure, and so defeat it. Such conduct might be respectable enough in a village debating society, but it was trivial among statesmen. It was out of place in so august an assemblage as the House of Representatives of the United States. The friends of the bill had been not only willing that its opponents should express their opinions, but had strongly desired it. They courted the fullest and freest discussion, but it seemed to him that this fairness was but illy appreciated, since gentlemen were capable of taking advantage of it for selfish and unworthy ends. This trifling had gone far enough. He called for the question. The instant Mr. Buckstone sat down, the storm burst forth. A dozen gentlemen sprang to their feet. "Mr. Speaker! Mr. Speaker! Mr. Speaker! Order! 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 Question! Question!" The sharp blows of the Speaker's gavel rose above the din. The previous question, that hated gag, was moved and carried. All debate came to a sudden end, of course. Triumph number one. Then the vote was taken on the adoption of the report, and it carried by a surprising majority. Mr. Buckstone got the floor again and moved that the rules be suspended and the bill read a first time. Mr. Trollope, "Second the motion." The Speaker, "It is moved," and clamor of voices. "Move we adjourn." Second the motion. "Adjourn! Adjourn! Order! Order!" The Speaker, after using his gavel vigorously, "It is moved and seconded that the House do now adjourn. All those in favor," voices, "Division! Division! Ayes and nays! Ayes and nays!" It was decided to vote upon the adjournment by ayes and nays. This was in earnest. The excitement was furious. The galleries were in commotion in an instant. The reporters swarmed to their places. Idling members of the House flocked to their seats. Nervous gentlemen sprang to their feet. Pages flew hither and thither. Life and animation were visible everywhere. All the long ranks of faces in the building were kindled. "This thing decides it," thought Mr. Buckstone, "but let the fight proceed." The voting began, and every sound ceased but the calling of the names and the aye, no, no, aye of the responses. There was not a movement in the House. The people seemed to hold their breath. The voting ceased, and then there was an interval of dead silence while the clerk made up his count. There was a two-thirds vote on the university side, and 2 over. The Speaker: "The rules are suspended. The motion is carried. First reading of the bill." By one impulse the galleries broke forth into stormy applause, and even some of the members of the House were not wholly able to restrain their feelings. The Speaker's gavel came to the rescue, and his clear voice followed. "Order, gentlemen! The House will come to order. If spectators offend again, the sergeant-at-arms will clear the galleries." Then he cast his eyes aloft and gazed at some object attentively for a moment. All eyes followed the direction of the Speaker's, and then there was a general titter. The Speaker said, "Let the sergeant-at-arms inform the gentleman that his conduct is an infringement of the dignity of the House, and one which is not warranted by the state of the weather." Poor Sellers was the culprit. He sat in the front seat of the gallery, with his arms and his tired body overflowing the balustrade, sound asleep, dead to all excitements, all disturbances. The fluctuations of the Washington weather had influenced his dreams, perhaps, for during the recent tempest of applause he had hoisted his gingham umbrella and calmly gone on with his slumbers. Washington Hawkins had seen the act, but was not near enough at hand to save his friend, and no one who was near enough desired to spoil the effect. But a neighbor stirred up the Colonel, now that the House had its eye upon him, and the great spectacular furled his tent like the Arab. He said, "Bless my soul, I'm so absent-minded when I get to thinking. I never wear an umbrella in the house. Did anybody notice it? What, asleep? Indeed? And did you wake me, sir? Thank you very much indeed. It might have fallen out of my hands and been injured. Admirable article, sir. Present from a friend in Hong Kong. One doesn't come across silk like that in this country. It's the real young Hyson, I'm told." By this time the incident was forgotten, for the House was at war again. Victory was almost in sight now, and the friends of the bill threw themselves into their work with enthusiasm. They soon moved and carried its second reading, and after a strong, sharp fight, carried a motion to go into committee of the whole. The Speaker left his place, of course, and a chairman was appointed. Now the contest raged hotter than ever, for the authority that compels order when the House sits as a House is greatly diminished when it sits as committee. The main fight came upon the filling of the blanks with a sum to be appropriated for the purchase of land, of course. Buckstone: "Mr. Chairman, I move you, sir, that the words 3 millions of be inserted." Mr. Hadley: "Mr. Chairman, I move that the words $2.50 be inserted." Mr. Clawson: "Mr. Chairman, I move the insertion of the words 25 cents as representing the true value of this barren and isolated tract of desolation." The question, according to rule, was taken upon the smallest sum first. It was lost. Then upon the next smallest sum. Lost also. And then upon the 3 millions. After a vigorous battle that lasted a considerable time, this motion was carried. Then, clause by clause, the bill was read, discussed, and amended in trifling particulars, and now the committee rose and reported. The moment the House had resumed its functions and received the report, Mr. Buckstone moved and carried the third reading of the bill. The same bitter war over the sum to be paid was fought over again, and now that the ayes and nays could be called and placed on record, every man was compelled to vote by name on the 3 millions, and indeed on every paragraph of the bill from enacting clause straight through. But as before, the friends of the measure stood firm and voted in a solid body every time, and so did its enemies. The supreme moment was come, now, but so sure was the result that not even a voice was raised to interpose an adjournment. The enemy were totally demoralized. The bill was put upon its final passage almost without dissent, and the calling of the ayes and nays began. When it was ended, the triumph was complete. 2/3 vote held good, and a veto was impossible, as far as the House was concerned. Mr. Buckstone resolved that now that the nail was driven home, he would clinch it on the other side and make it stay forever. He moved a reconsideration of the vote by which the bill had passed. The motion was lost, of course, and the great Industrial University Act was an accomplished fact as far as it was in the power of the House of Representatives to make it so. There was no need to move an adjournment. The instant the last motion was decided, the enemies of the university rose and flocked out of the hall, talking angrily, and its friends flocked after them, jubilant and congratulatory. The galleries disgorged their burden, and presently the house was silent and deserted. When Colonel Sellers and Washington stepped out of the building, they were surprised to find that the daylight was old and the sun well up. Said the Colonel, "Give me your hand, my boy. You're all right at last. You're a millionaire. At least you're going to be. The thing is dead sure. Don't you bother about the Senate. Leave me and Dilworthy to take care of that. Run along home now and tell Laura. Lord, it's magnificent news, perfectly magnificent. Run now. I'll telegraph my wife. She must come here and help me build a house. Everything's all right now." Washington was so dazed by his good fortune and so bewildered by the gaudy pageant of dreams that was already trailing its long ranks through his brain, that he wandered he knew not where, and so loitered by the way that when at last he reached home he woke to a sudden annoyance in the fact that his news must be old to Laura now, for of course Senator Dilworthy must have already been home and told her an hour before. He knocked at her door, but there was no answer. "That is like the Duchess," said he. "Always cool. A body can't excite her, can't keep her excited, anyway. Now she has gone off to sleep again, as comfortably as if she were used to picking up $1,000,000 every day or two." Then he went to bed, but he could not sleep. So he got up and wrote a long, rapturous letter to Louise, and another to his mother, and he closed both to much the same effect. "Laura will be Queen of America now, and she will be applauded and honored and petted by the whole nation. Her name will be in everyone's mouth more than ever, and how they will court her and quote her bright speeches. And mine, too, I suppose, though they do that more already than they really seem to deserve. Oh, the world is so bright now, and so cheery. The clouds are all gone, our long struggle is ended, our troubles are all over. Nothing can ever make us unhappy any more. You dear, faithful ones will have the reward of your patient waiting now. How father's wisdom is proven at last, and how I repent me that there have been times when I lost faith and said the blessing he stored up for us a tedious generation ago was but a long-drawn curse, a blight upon us all. But everything is well now. We are done with poverty, sad toil, weariness, and heartbreak. All the world is filled with sunshine. End of chapter 45. This is section 46 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner. Chapter 46. Philip left the Capitol and walked up Pennsylvania Avenue in company with Senator Dilworthy. It was a bright spring morning. The air was soft and inspiring. In the deepening wayside green, the pink blush of the blossoming peach trees, the soft suffusion on the heights of Arlington, and the breath of the warm south wind was apparent, the annual miracle of the resurrection of the earth. The senator took off his hat and seemed to open his soul to the sweet influences of the morning. After the heat and noise of the chamber, under its dull gas-illuminated glass canopy, and the all-night struggle of passion and feverish excitement there, the open, tranquil world seemed like heaven. The senator was not in an exultant mood, but rather in a condition of holy joy, befitting a Christian statesman whose benevolent plans Providence has made its own and stamped with approval. The great battle had been fought, but the measure had still to encounter the scrutiny of the Senate, and Providence sometimes acts differently in the two houses. Still the senator was tranquil, for he knew that there is an esprit de corps in the Senate which does not exist in the House, the effect of which is to make the members complacent towards the projects of each other, and to extend a mutual aid which in a more vulgar body would be called log-rolling. "It is under Providence a good night's work, Mr. Sterling. The government has founded an institution which will remove half the difficulty from the Southern problem, and it is a good thing for the Hawkins heirs, a very good thing. Laura will be almost a millionaire." "Do you think, Mr. Dilworthy, that the Hawkinses will get much of the money?" asked Philip innocently, remembering the fate of the Columbus River appropriation. The Senator looked at his companion scrutinizingly for a moment to see if he meant anything personal, and then replied, "Undoubtedly, undoubtedly. I have had their interests greatly at heart. There will, of course, be a few expenses, but the widow and orphans will realize all that Mr. Hawkins dreamed of for them." The birds were singing as they crossed the presidential square, now bright with its green turf and tender foliage. After the two had gained the steps of the Senator's house, they stood a moment, looking upon the lovely prospect. "It is like the peace of God," said the Senator devoutly. Entering the house, the Senator called a servant and said, "Tell Miss Laura that we are waiting to see her. I ought to have sent a messenger on horseback half an hour ago," he added to Philip. "She will be transported with our victory. You must stop to breakfast and see the excitement." The servant soon came back with a wondering look and reported, "Miss Laura ain't dead, sah. I reckon she ain't been there all night." The Senator and Philip both started up. In Laura's room there were the marks of a confused and hasty departure, drawers half open, little articles strewn on the floor. The bed had not been disturbed. Upon inquiry it appeared that Laura had not been at dinner, excusing herself to Mrs. Dilworthy on the plea of a violent headache, that she made a request to the servants that she might not be disturbed. The Senator was astounded. Philip thought at once of Colonel Selby. Could Laura have run away with him? The Senator thought not. In fact, it could not be. General Leffenwell, the member from New Orleans, had casually told him at the house last night that Selby and his family went to New York yesterday morning and were to sail for Europe today. Philip had another idea which he did not mention. He seized his hat, and saying that he would go and see what he could learn, ran to the lodgings of Harry, whom he had not seen since yesterday afternoon when he left him to go to the house. Harry was not in. He had gone out with a handbag before 6 o'clock yesterday, saying that he had to go to New York, but should return next day. In Harry's room, on the table, Philip found this note: "Dear Mr. Brierly, can you meet me at the 6 o'clock train and be my escort to New York? I have to go about this university bill. The vote of an absent member we must have here. Senator Dilworthy cannot go. Yours, L. H." "Confound it," said Philip. "The noodle has fallen into her trap, and she promised she would let him alone." He only stopped to send a note to Senator Dilworthy telling him what he had found, and that he should go at once to New York, and then hasten to the railway station. He had to wait an hour for a train, but when it did start it seemed to go at a snail's pace. Philip was devoured with anxiety. Where could they have gone? What was Laura's object in taking Harry? Had the flight anything to do with Selby? Would Harry be such a fool as to be dragged into some public scandal? It seemed as if the train would never reach Baltimore. Then there was a long delay at Havre de Grace. A hot box had to be cooled at Wilmington. Would it never get on? Only in passing around the city of Philadelphia did the train not seem to go slow. Philip stood upon the platform and watched for the Boltons' house, fancied he could distinguish its roof among the trees, and wondered how Ruth would feel if she knew he was so near her. Then came Jersey, everlasting Jersey, stupid, irritating Jersey, where the passengers are always asking which line they are on, and where they are to come out, and whether they have yet reached Elizabeth. Launched into Jersey, one has a vague notion that he is on many lines and no one in particular, and that he is liable at any moment to come to Elizabeth. He has no notion what Elizabeth is, and always resolves that the next time he goes that way he will look out of the window and see what it is like, but he never does, or if he does he probably finds that it is Princeton or something of that sort. He gets annoyed, and never can see the use of having different names for stations in Jersey. By and by there is Newark, 3 or 4 Newarks apparently. Then marshes. Then long rock cuttings devoted to the advertisements of patent medicines and ready-made clothing, and New York tonics for Jersey agues, and Jersey City is reached. On the ferry-boat, Philip bought an evening paper from a boy crying, "Here's the Evening Gram, all about the murder," and with breathless haste ran his eyes over the following: "Shocking murder. Tragedy in high life.
A beautiful woman shoots a distinguished Confederate soldier at the Southern Hotel. Jealousy the cause. This morning occurred another of those shocking murders which have become the almost daily food of the newspapers, the direct result of the socialistic doctrines and women's rights agitations which have made every woman the avenger of her own wrongs, and all society the hunting ground for her victims. About 9 o'clock a lady deliberately shot a man dead in the public parlor of the Southern Hotel, coolly remarking, as she threw down her revolver and permitted herself to be taken into custody, "He brought it on himself." Our reporters were immediately dispatched to the scene of the tragedy and gathered the following particulars. Yesterday afternoon arrived at the hotel from Washington Colonel George Selby and family, who had taken passage and were to sail at noon today in the steamer Scotia for England. The colonel was a handsome man about 40, a gentleman of wealth and high social position, a resident of New Orleans. He served with distinction in the Confederate army and received a wound in the leg from which he has never entirely recovered, being obliged to use a cane in locomotion. This morning at about 9 o'clock a lady accompanied by a gentleman called at the office of the hotel and asked for Colonel Selby. The colonel was at breakfast. Would the clerk tell him that a lady and gentleman wished to see him for a moment in the parlor? The clerk says that the gentleman asked her, "What do you want to see him for?" and that she replied, "He is going to Europe, and I ought to just say good-bye." Colonel Selby was informed, and the lady and the gentleman were shown to the parlor, in which were at the time 3 or 4 other persons. 5 minutes after, 2 shots were fired in quick succession, and there was a rush to the parlor from which the reports came. Colonel Selby was found lying on the floor bleeding, but not dead. 2 gentlemen who had just come in had seized the lady, who made no resistance, and she was at once given in charge of a police officer who arrived. The persons who were in the parlor agree substantially as to what occurred. They had happened to be looking towards the door when the man, Colonel Selby, entered with his cane, and they looked at him, because he stopped as if surprised and frightened, and made a backward movement. At the same moment the lady in the bonnet advanced towards him, and said something like, "George, will you go with me?" He replied, throwing up his hands and retreating, "My God, I can't, don't fire!" and the next instant 2 shots were heard, and he fell. The lady appeared to be beside herself with rage or excitement, and trembled very much when the gentlemen took hold of her. It was to them she said, "He brought it on himself." Colonel Selby was carried at once to his room, and Dr. Puffer, the eminent surgeon, was sent for. It was found that he was shot through the breast and through the abdomen. Other aid was summoned, but the wounds were mortal, and Colonel Selby expired in an hour, in pain, but his mind was clear to the last, and he made a full deposition. The substance of it was that his murderess is a Miss Laura Hawkins, whom he had known at Washington as a lobbyist, and had some business with her. She had followed him with her attentions and solicitations, and had endeavored to make him desert his wife and go to Europe with her. When he resisted and avoided her, she had threatened him. Only the day before he left Washington she had declared that he should never go out of the city alive without her. It seems to have been a deliberate and premeditated murder, the woman following him to Washington on purpose to commit it. We learn that the murderess, who is a woman of dazzling and transcendent beauty and about 26 or 7, is a niece of Senator Dilworthy, at whose house she has been spending the winter. She belongs to a high Southern family, and has the reputation of being an heiress. Like some other great beauties and belles in Washington, however, there have been whispers that she had something to do with the lobby. If we mistake not, we have heard her name mentioned in connection with the sale of the Tennessee lands to the Knobs University, the bill for which passed the House last night. Her companion is Mr. Harry Brierly, a New York dandy, who has been in Washington. His connection with her and with this tragedy is not known, but he was also taken into custody, and will be detained at least as a witness. P.S. One of the persons present in the parlor says that after Laura Hawkins had fired twice, she turned the pistol toward herself, but that Brierly sprung and caught it from her hand, and that it was he who threw it on the floor. Further particulars with full biographies of all the parties in our next edition.
Philip hastened at once to the Southern Hotel, where he found still a great state of excitement, and 1,000 different and exaggerated stories passing from mouth to mouth. The witnesses of the event had told it over so many times that they had worked it up into a most dramatic scene, and embellished it with whatever could heighten its awfulness. Outsiders had taken up invention also. The Colonel's wife had gone insane, they said. The children had rushed into the parlor and rolled themselves in their father's blood. The hotel clerk said that he noticed there was murder in the woman's eye when he saw her. A person who had met the woman on the stairs felt a creeping sensation. Some thought Brierly was an accomplice, and that he had set the woman on to kill his rival. Some said the woman showed the calmness and indifference of insanity. Philip learned that Harry and Laura had both been taken to the city prison, and he went there, but he was not admitted. Not being a newspaper reporter, he could not see either of them that night, but the officer questioned him suspiciously and asked him who he was. He might perhaps see Brierly in the morning. The latest editions of the evening papers had the result of the inquest. It was a plain enough case for the jury, but they sat over it a long time, listening to the wrangling of the physicians. Dr. Puffer insisted that the man died from the effects of the wound in the chest. Dr. Dobb as strongly insisted the wound in the abdomen caused the death. Dr. Golightly suggested that in his opinion death ensued from a complication of the two wounds and perhaps other causes. He examined the table waiter as to whether Colonel Selby ate any breakfast, and what he ate, and if he had any appetite. The jury finally threw themselves back upon the indisputable fact that Selby was dead, that either wound would have killed him, admitted by the doctors, and rendered a verdict that he died from pistol-shot wounds inflicted by a pistol in the hands of Laura Hawkins. The morning papers blazed with big type, and overflowed with details of the murder. The accounts in the evening papers were only the premonitory drops to this mighty shower. The scene was dramatically worked up in column after column. There were sketches, biographical and historical. There were long specials from Washington, giving a full history of Laura's career there, with the names of men with whom she was said to be intimate, a description of Senator Dilworthy's residence and of his family, and of Laura's room in his house, and a sketch of the Senator's appearance and what he said. There was a great deal about her beauty, her accomplishments, and her brilliant position in society, and her doubtful position in society. There was also an interview with Colonel Sellers, and another with Washington Hawkins, the brother of the murderess. One journal had a long dispatch from Hawkeye, reporting the excitement in that quiet village, and the reception of the awful intelligence. All the parties had been interviewed. There were reports of conversations with the clerk at the hotel, with the call-boy, with the waiter at table with all the witnesses, with the policeman, with the landlord, who wanted it understood that nothing of that sort had ever happened in his house before, although it had always been frequented by the best Southern society, and with Mrs. Colonel Selby. There were diagrams illustrating the scene of the shooting, and views of the hotel and street, and portraits of the parties. There were 3 minute and different statements from the doctors about the wounds, so technically worded that nobody could understand them. Harry and Laura had also been interviewed, and there was a statement from Philip himself, which a reporter had knocked him up out of bed at midnight to give, though how he found him Philip never could conjecture. What some of the journals lacked in suitable length for the occasion they made up in encyclopedic information about other similar murders and shootings. The statement from Laura was not full. In fact, it was fragmentary, and consisted of 9 parts of the reporter's valuable observations to one of Laura's, and it was, as the reporter significantly remarked, incoherent, but it appeared that Laura claimed to be Selby's wife, or to have been his wife, that he had deserted her and betrayed her, and that she was going to follow him to Europe. When the reporter asked, "What made you shoot him, Miss Hawkins?" Laura's only reply was, very simply, "Did I shoot him? Do they say I shot him?" And she would say no more. The news of the murder was made the excitement of the day. Talk of it filled the town. The facts reported were scrutinized, the standing of the parties was discussed, the dozen different theories of the motive, broached in the newspapers, were disputed over. During the night, subtle electricity had carried the tale over all the wires of the continent and under the sea, and in all the villages and towns of the Union
from the Atlantic to the Territories, and away up and down the Pacific slope, and as far as London and Paris and Berlin. That morning the name of Laura Hawkins was spoken by millions and millions of people, while the owner of it, the sweet child of years ago, the beautiful queen of Washington drawing-rooms, sat shivering on her cot-bed in the darkness of a damp cell in the Tombs. End of chapter 46. This is section 47 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner. Chapter 47. Philip's first effort was to get Harry out of the Tombs. He gained permission to see him, in the presence of an officer, during the day, and he found that hero very much cast down. "I never intended to come to such a place as this, old fellow," he said to Philip. "It's no place for a gentleman. They've no idea how to treat a gentleman. Look at that provender," pointing to his uneaten prison ration. "They tell me I am detained as a witness, and I passed the night among a lot of cutthroats and dirty rascals. A pretty witness I'd be in a month spent in such company." "But what under heavens," asked Philip, "induced you to come to New York with Laura? What was it for?" "What for? Why, she wanted me to come. I didn't know anything about that cursed Selby. She said it was lobby business for the university. I'd no idea what she was dragging me into that confounded hotel for. I suppose she knew that the Southerners all go there, and thought she'd find her man. Oh, Lord, I wish I'd taken your advice. You might as well murder somebody and have the credit of it as get into the papers the way I have. She's pure devil, that girl. You ought to have seen how sweet she was on me. What an ass I am." "Well, I'm not going to dispute a poor prisoner, but the first thing is to get you out of this. I've brought the note Laura wrote you, for one thing, and I've seen your uncle, and explained the truth of the case to him. He will be here soon." Harry's uncle came, with other friends, and in the course of the day made such a showing to the authorities that Harry was released, on giving bonds to appear as a witness when wanted. His spirits rose, with their usual elasticity, as soon as he was out of Centre Street, and he insisted on giving Philip and his friends a royal supper at Delmonico's, an excess which was perhaps excusable in the rebound of his feelings, and which was committed with his usual reckless generosity. Harry ordered the supper, and it is perhaps needless to say that Philip paid the bill. Neither of the young men felt like attempting to see Laura that day, and she saw no company except the newspaper reporters until the arrival of Colonel Sellers and Washington Hawkins, who had hastened to New York with all speed. They found Laura in a cell in the upper tier of the women's department. The cell was somewhat larger than those in the men's department, and might be 8 feet by 10 square, perhaps a little longer. It was of stone, floor and all, and tile roof was oven-shaped. A narrow slit in the roof admitted sufficient light, and was the only means of ventilation. When the window was opened, there was nothing to prevent the rain coming in. The only means of heating being from the corridor. When the door was ajar, the cell was chilly, and at this time damp. It was whitewashed and clean, but it had a slight jail odor. Its only furniture was a narrow iron bedstead, with a tick of straw and some blankets, not too clean. When Colonel Sellers was conducted to this cell by the matron and looked in, his emotions quite overcame him. The tears rolled down his cheeks, and his voice trembled so that he could hardly speak. Washington was unable to say anything. He looked from Laura to the miserable creatures who were walking in the corridor with unutterable disgust. Laura was alone, calm and self-contained, though she was not unmoved by the sight of the grief of her friends. "Are you comfortable, Laura?" was the first word the colonel could get out.
"You see," she replied, "I can't say it's exactly comfortable."
"Are you cold?"
"It is pretty chilly. The stone floor is like ice. It chills me through to step on it. I have to sit on the bed."
"Poor thing, poor thing! And can you eat anything?"
"No, I am not hungry. I don't know that I could eat anything. I can't eat that."
"Oh, dear," continued the colonel, "it's dreadful. But cheer up, dear, cheer up," and the colonel broke down entirely. "But," he went on, "we'll stand by you.
We'll do everything for you. I know you couldn't have meant to do it. It must have been insanity, you know, or something of that sort. You never did anything of the sort before."
Laura smiled very faintly and said, "Yes, it was something of that sort. It's all a whirl. He was a villain. You don't know."
"I'd rather have killed him myself in a duel, you know, all fair. I wish I had. But don't you be down. We'll get you the best counsel. The lawyers in New York can do anything. I've read of cases. But you must be comfortable now. We've brought some of your clothes at the hotel. What else can we get for you?"
Laura suggested that she would like some sheets for her bed, a piece of carpet to step on, and her meals sent in, and some books and writing materials if it was allowed. The Colonel and Washington promised to procure all these things, and then took their sorrowful leave, a great deal more affected than the criminal was, apparently, by her situation. The Colonel told the matron as he went away that if she would look to Laura's comfort a little it shouldn't be the worse for her, and to the turnkey who let them out he patronizingly said,
"You've got a big establishment here, a credit to the city. I've got a friend in there. I shall see you again, sir."
By the next day something more of Laura's own story began to appear in the newspapers, colored and heightened by reporters' rhetoric. Some of them cast a lurid light upon the Colonel's career, and represented his victim as a beautiful avenger of her murdered innocence, and others pictured her as his willing paramour and pitiless slayer. Her communications to the reporters were stopped by her lawyers as soon as they were retained, and visited her, but this fact did not prevent, it may have facilitated, the appearance of casual paragraphs here and there, which were likely to beget popular sympathy for the poor girl. The occasion did not pass without improvement by the leading journals, and Philip preserved the editorial comments of 3 or 4 of them which pleased him most. These he used to read aloud to his friends afterwards, and ask them to guess from which journal each of them had been cut. One began in this simple manner: "History never repeats itself, but the kaleidoscopic combinations of the pictured present often seem to be constructed out of the broken fragments of antique legends. Washington is not Corinth, and Lais, the beautiful daughter of Timandra, might not have been the prototype of the ravishing Laura, daughter of the plebeian house of Hawkins, but the orators and statesmen who were the purchasers of the favors of the one may have been as incorruptible as the republican statesmen who learned how to love and how to vote from the sweet lips of the Washington lobbyist, and perhaps the modern Lais would never have departed from the national capital if there had been there even one republican Xenocrates who resisted her blandishments. But here the parallel fails. Lais, wandering away with the youth Repostratus, is slain by the women who are jealous of her charms. Laura, straying into her Thessaly with the youth Brierly, slays her other lover, and becomes the champion of the wrongs of her sex. Another journal began its editorial with less lyrical beauty, but with equal force. It closed as follows: "With Laura Hawkins, fair, fascinating, and fatal, and with the dissolute colonel of a lost cause, who has reaped the harvest he sowed, we have nothing to do. But as the curtain rises on this awful tragedy, we catch a glimpse of the society at the Capitol under this administration, which we cannot contemplate without alarm for the fate of the Republic." A third newspaper took up the subject in a different tone. It said, "Our repeated predictions are verified. The pernicious doctrines which we have announced as prevailing in American society have been again illustrated. The name of the city is becoming a reproach. We may have done something in averting its ruin in our resolute exposure of the great frauds. We shall not be deterred from insisting that the outraged laws for the protection of human life shall be vindicated now, so that a person can walk the streets or enter the public houses, at least in the daytime, without the risk of a bullet through his brain." A fourth journal began its remarks as follows: "The fullness with which we present our readers this morning the details of the Selby Hawkins homicide is a miracle of modern journalism. Subsequent investigation can do little to fill out the picture. It is the old story.
A beautiful woman shoots her absconding lover in cold blood, and we shall doubtless learn in due time that if she was not as mad as a hare in this month of March, she was at least laboring under what is termed momentary insanity. It would not be too much to say that upon the first publication of the facts of the tragedy there was an almost universal feeling of rage against the murderess in the Tombs, and that reports of her beauty only heightened the indignation. It was as if she presumed upon that and upon her sex to defy the law, and there was a fervent hope that the law would take its plain course. Yet Laura was not without friends, and some of them very influential, too. She had in her keeping a great many secrets and a great many reputations, perhaps. Who shall set himself up to judge human motives? Why, indeed, might we not feel pity for a woman whose brilliant career had been so suddenly extinguished in misfortune and crime? Those who had known her so well in Washington might find it impossible to believe that the fascinating woman could have had murder in her heart, and would readily give ear to the current sentimentality about the temporary aberration of mind under the stress of personal calamity. Senator Dilworthy was greatly shocked, of course, but he was full of charity for the erring. "We shall all need mercy," he said. "Laura, as an inmate of my family, was a most exemplary female, amiable, affectionate, and truthful, perhaps too fond of gaiety and neglectful of the externals of religion, but a woman of principle. She may have had experiences of which I am ignorant, but she could not have gone to this extremity if she had been in her own right mind." To the Senator's credit, be it said, he was willing to help Laura and her family in this dreadful trial. She herself was not without money, for the Washington lobbyist is not seldom more fortunate than the Washington claimant, and she was able to procure a good many luxuries to mitigate the severity of her prison life. It enabled her also to have her own family near her, and to see some of them daily. The tender solicitude of her mother, her childlike grief, and her firm belief in the real guiltlessness of her daughter, touched even the custodians of the Tombs, who are inured to scenes of pathos. Mrs. Hawkins had hastened to her daughter as soon as she received money for the journey. She had no reproaches, she had only tenderness and pity. She could not shut out the dreadful facts of the case, but it had been enough for her that Laura had said in their first interview, "Mother, I did not know what I was doing." She obtained lodgings near the prison, and devoted her life to her daughter, as if she had been really her only child. She would have remained in the prison day and night if it had been permitted. She was aged and feeble, but this great necessity seemed to give her new life. The pathetic story of the old lady's ministrations and her simplicity and faith also got into the newspapers in time, and probably added to the pathos of this wrecked woman's fate, which was beginning to be felt by the public. It was certain that she had champions who thought that her wrongs ought to be placed against her crime, and expressions of this feeling came to her in various ways. Visitors came to see her, and gifts of fruit and flowers were sent, which brought some cheer into her hard and gloomy cell. Laura had declined to see either Philip or Harry, somewhat to the former's relief, who had a notion that she would necessarily feel humiliated by seeing him after breaking faith with him, but to the discomfiture of Harry, who still felt her fascination, and thought her refusal heartless. He told Philip that of course he had got through with such a woman, but he wanted to see her. Philip, to keep him from some new foolishness, persuaded him to go with him to Philadelphia, and give his valuable services in the mining operations at Ilium. The law took its course with Laura. She was indicted for murder in the first degree and held for trial at the summer term. The two most distinguished criminal lawyers in the city had been retained for her defense, and to that the resolute woman devoted her days with a courage that rose as she consulted with her counsel and understood the methods of criminal procedure in New York. She was greatly depressed, however, by the news from Washington. Congress adjourned, and her bill had failed to pass the Senate. It must wait for the next session. End of chapter 47. This is section 48 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, Chapter 48. It had been a bad winter, somehow, for the firm of Pennybacker, Bigler, and Small. These celebrated contractors usually made more money during the session of the legislature at Harrisburg than upon all their summer work, and this winter had been unfruitful. It was unaccountable to Bigler. "You see, Mr. Bolton," he said, and Philip was present at the conversation, "it puts us all out. It looks as if politics was played out. We'd counted on the year of Simon's re-election, and, well, now he's re-elected, and I've yet to see the first man who's the better for it." "You don't mean to say," asked Philip, "that he went in without paying anything?" "Not a cent, not a dash cent, as I can hear," repeated Mr. Bigler indignantly. "I call it a swindle on the state. How it was done gets me. I never saw such a tight time for money in Harrisburg."
"Were there no combinations, no railroad jobs, no mining schemes put through in connection with the election?"
"Not that I knew," said Bigler, shaking his head in disgust. "In fact, it was openly said that there was no money in the election. It's perfectly unheard of."
"Perhaps," suggested Philip, "it was effected on what the insurance companies call the endowment, or the paid-up plan, by which a policy is secured after a certain time without further payment."
"What do you think, then," said Mr. Bolton, smiling, "that a liberal and sagacious politician might own a legislature after a time and not be bothered with keeping up his payments?" "Whatever it is," interrupted Mr. Bigler, "it's devilish ingenious and goes ahead of my calculations. It's cleaned me out when I thought we had a dead sure thing. I tell you what it is, gentlemen, I shall go in for the reform. Things have got pretty mixed up when a legislature will give away a United States senatorship."
It was melancholy, but Mr. Bigler was not a man to be crushed by one misfortune, or to lose his confidence in human nature on one exhibition of apparent honesty. He was already on his feet again, or would be if Mr. Bolton could tide him over shoal water for 90 days.
"We've got something with money in it," he explained to Mr. Bolton. "Got hold of it by good luck. We've got the entire contract for Dobson's patent pavement for the city of Mobile. See here."
Mr. Bigler made some figures: contract so much, cost of work and materials so much, profits so much. At the end of 3 months the city would owe the company $375,000. 200,000 of that would be profits. The whole job was worth at least $1,000,000 to the company. It might be more. There could be no mistake in these figures. Here was the contract. Mr. Bolton knew what materials were worth and what the labor would cost. Mr. Bolton knew perfectly well from sore experience that there was always a mistake in figures when Bigler or Small made them, and he knew that he ought to send the fellow about his business. Instead of that, he let him talk. They only wanted to raise $50,000 to carry on the contract. That expended, they would have city bonds. Mr. Bolton said he hadn't the money, but Bigler could raise it on his name. Mr. Bolton said he had no right to put his family to that risk. But the entire contract could be assigned to him. The security was ample. It was a fortune to him if it was forfeited. Besides, Mr. Bigler had been unfortunate. He didn't know where to look for the necessaries of life for his family. If he could only have one more chance, he was sure he could right himself. He begged for it. And Mr. Bolton yielded. He could never refuse such appeals. If he had befriended a man once and been cheated by him, that man appeared to have a claim upon him forever. He shrank, however, from telling his wife what he had done on this occasion, for he knew that if any person was more odious than Small to his family, it was Bigler.
"Philip tells me," Mrs. Bolton said that evening, "that the man Bigler has been with thee again today. I hope thee will have nothing more to do with him."
"He has been very unfortunate," replied Mr. Bolton uneasily.
"He is always unfortunate, and he is always getting thee into trouble. But thee didn't listen to him again?"
"Well, mother, his family is in want, and I lent him my name. But I took ample security. The worst that can happen will be a little inconvenience."
Mrs. Bolton looked grave and anxious, but she did not complain or remonstrate. She knew what a little convenience meant, but she knew there was no help for it. If Mr. Bolton had been on his way to market to buy a dinner for his family with the only dollar he had in the world in his pocket, he would have given it to a chance beggar who asked him for it. Mrs. Bolton only asked, and the question showed that she was no mere provident than her husband where her heart was interested.
"But has thee provided money for Philip to use in opening the coal mine?"
"Yes, I have set apart as much as it ought to cost to open the mine, as much as we can afford to lose if no coal is found. Philip has control of it, as equal partner in the venture, deducting the capital invested. He has great confidence in his success, and I hope for his sake he won't be disappointed." Philip could not but feel that he was treated very much like one of the Bolton family, by all except Ruth. His mother, when he went home after his recovery from his accident, had affected to be very jealous of Mrs. Bolton, about whom and Ruth she asked 1,000 questions, an affectation of jealousy which no doubt concealed a real heartache, which comes to every mother when her son goes out into the world and forms new ties. And to Mrs. Sterling, a widow living on a small income in a remote Massachusetts village, Philadelphia was a city of many splendors. All its inhabitants seemed highly favored, dwelling in ease, and surrounded by superior advantages. Some of her neighbors had relations living in Philadelphia, and it seemed to them, somehow, a guarantee of respectability to have relations in Philadelphia. Mrs. Sterling was not sorry to have Philip make his way among such well-to-do people, and she was sure that no good fortune could be too good for his deserts.
"So, sir," said Ruth, when Philip came from New York, "you have been assisting in a pretty tragedy. I saw your name in the papers. Is this woman a specimen of your Western friends?"
"My only assistance," replied Philip, a little annoyed, "was in trying to keep Harry out of a bad scrape, and I failed after all. He walked into her trap, and he has been punished for it. I'm going to take him up to Ilium to see if he won't work steadily at one thing and quit his nonsense."
"Is she as beautiful as the newspapers say she is?"
"I don't know. She has a kind of beauty. She is not like—"
"Not like Alice?"
"Well, she is brilliant. She was called the handsomest woman in Washington, dashing, you know, and sarcastic and witty. Ruth, do you believe a woman ever becomes a devil?"
"Men do, and I don't know why women shouldn't, but I never saw one."
"Well, Laura Hawkins comes very near it, but it is dreadful to think of her fate."
"Why? Do you suppose they will hang a woman? Do you suppose they will be so barbarous as that?"
"Well, I wasn't thinking of that. It's doubtful if a New York jury would find a woman guilty of any such crime. But to think of her life, if she is acquitted."
"It is dreadful," said Ruth thoughtfully. "But the worst of it is that you men do not want women educated to do anything, to be able to earn an honest living by their own exertions. They are educated as if they were always to be petted and supported, and there was never to be any such thing as misfortune. I suppose, now, that you would all choose to have me stay idly at home and give up my profession."
"Oh, no," said Philip earnestly. "I respect your resolution.
"But, Ruth, do you think you would be happier or do more good in following your profession than in having a home of your own?" "What is to hinder having a home of my own?"
"Nothing, perhaps, only you never would be in it. You would be away day and night, if you had any practice."
"And what sort of a home would that make for your husband?" "What sort of a home is it for the wife whose husband is always away riding about in his doctor's gig?"
"Ah, you know that is not fair. The woman makes the home." Philip and Ruth often had this sort of discussion, to which Philip was always trying to give a personal turn. He was now about to go to Ilium for the season, and he did not like to go without some assurance from Ruth that she might perhaps love him some day, when he was worthy of it, and when he could offer her something better than a partnership in his poverty.
"I should work with a great deal better heart, Ruth," he said the morning he was taking his leave, "if I knew you cared for me a little."
Ruth was looking down. The color came faintly to her cheeks, and she hesitated. She needn't be looking down, he thought, for she was ever so much shorter than tall Philip. "It's not much of a place, Ilium," Philip went on, as if a little geographical remark would fit in here as well as anything else, "and I shall have plenty of time to think over the responsibility I have taken, and—" His observation did not seem to be coming out anywhere. But Ruth looked up, and there was a light in her eyes that quickened Phil's pulse. She took his hand and said with serious sweetness,
"Thee mustn't lose heart, Philip." And then she added in another mood, "Thee knows I graduate in the summer and shall have my diploma, and if anything happens, mines explode sometimes, thee can send for me. Farewell."
The opening of the Ilium coal mine was begun with energy, but without many omens of success. Philip was running a tunnel into the breast of the mountain, in faith that the coal stratum ran there as it ought to. How far he must go in he believed he knew, but no one could tell exactly. Some of the miners said that they should probably go through the mountain, and that the hole could be used for a railway tunnel. The mining camp was a busy place at any rate. Quite a settlement of board and log shanties had gone up, with a blacksmith shop, a small machine shop, and a temporary store for supplying the wants of the workmen. Philip and Harry pitched a commodious tent and lived in the full enjoyment of the free life. There is no difficulty in digging a hole in the ground, if you have money enough to pay for the digging, but those who try this sort of work are always surprised at the large amount of money necessary to make a small hole. The earth is never willing to yield one product, hidden in her bosom, without an equivalent for it, and when a person asks of her coal, she is quite apt to require gold in exchange. It was exciting work for all concerned in it. As the tunnel advanced into the rock, every day promised to be the golden day. This very blast might disclose the treasure. The work went on week after week, and at length during the night as well as the daytime. Gangs relieved each other, and the tunnel was every hour, inch by inch and foot by foot, crawling into the mountain. Philip was on the stretch of hope and excitement. Every payday he saw his funds melting away, and still there was only the faintest show of what the miners call signs. The life suited Harry, whose buoyant hopefulness was never disturbed. He made endless calculations, which nobody could understand, of the probable position of the vein. He stood about among the workmen with the busiest air. When he was down at Ilium he called himself the engineer of the works, and he used to spend hours smoking his pipe with the Dutch landlord on the hotel porch, and astonishing the idlers there with the stories of his railroad operations in Missouri. He talked with the landlord, too, about enlarging his hotel, and about buying some village lots in the prospect of a rise when the mine was opened. He taught the Dutchman how to mix a great many cooling drinks for the summer time, and had a bill at the hotel, the growing length of which Mr. Dusenheimer contemplated with pleasant anticipations. Mr. Brierly was a very useful and cheering person wherever he went. Midsummer arrived. Philip could report to Mr. Bolton only progress, and this was not a cheerful message for him to send to Philadelphia in reply to inquiries that he thought became more and more anxious. Philip himself was a prey to the constant fear that the money would give out before the coal was struck. At this time Harry was summoned to New York to attend the trial of Laura Hawkins. It was possible that Philip would have to go also, her lawyer wrote, but they hoped for a postponement. There was important evidence that they could not yet obtain, and he hoped the judge would not force them to a trial unprepared. There were many reasons for a delay, reasons which of course are never mentioned, but which it would seem that a New York judge sometimes must understand when he grants a postponement upon a motion that seems to the public altogether inadequate. Harry went, but he soon came back. The trial was put off. Every week we can gain, said the learned counsel, Braham, improves our chances. The popular rage never lasts long. End of chapter 48. This is section 49 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner. Chapter 49. "We've struck it!" This was the announcement at the tent door that woke Philip out of a sound sleep at dead of night, and shook all the sleepiness out of him in a trice. "What? Where is it? When? Coal? Let me see. What quality is it?" were some of the rapid questions that Philip poured out as he hurriedly dressed. "Harry, wake up, my boy! The coal train is coming. Struck it, eh? Let's see." The foreman put down his lantern and handed Philip a black lump. There was no mistake about it. It was the hard, shining anthracite, and its freshly fractured surface glistened in the light like polished steel. Diamond never shone with such luster in the eyes of Philip. Harry was exuberant, but Philip's natural caution found expression in his next remark.
"Now, Roberts, you are sure about this?" "What? Sure that it's coal?"
"Oh, no, sure that it's the main vein."
"Well, yes. We took it to be that."
"Did you from the first?"
"Well, I can't say we did at first. No, we didn't. Most of the indications were there, but not all of them. Not all of them. So we thought we'd prospect a bit."
"Well?"
"It was tolerable thick, and looked as if it might be the vein, looked as if it ought to be the vein. Then we went down on it a little, looked better all the time."
"When did you strike it?"
"About 10 o'clock."
"And you've been prospecting about 4 hours?"
"Yes, been sinking on it something over 4 hours."
"I'm afraid you couldn't go down very far in 4 hours, could you?"
"Oh, yes, it's a good deal broke up, nothing but picking and gadding stuff."
"Well, it does look encouraging, sure enough, but then the lacking indications—"
"I'd rather we had them, Mr. Sterling, but I've seen more than one good permanent mine struck without 'em in my time."
"Well, that is encouraging, too."
"Yes, there was the Union, the Alabama, and the Black Mohawk, all good, sound mines, you know, all just exactly like this one when we first struck them."
"Well, I begin to feel a good deal more easy. I guess we've really got it. I remember hearing them tell about the Black Mohawk."
"I'm free to say that I believe it, and the men all think so, too. They are all old hands at this business."
"Come, Harry, let's go up and look at it, just for the comfort of it," said Philip. They came back in the course of an hour, satisfied and happy. There was no more sleep for them that night. They lit their pipes, put a specimen of the coal on the table, and made it a kind of lodestone of thought and conversation.
"Of course," said Harry, "there will have to be a branch track built, and a switchback up the hill."
"Yes, there will be no trouble about getting the money for that now. We could sell out tomorrow for a handsome sum.
That sort of coal doesn't go begging within a mile of a railroad.
I wonder if Mr. Bolton would rather sell out or work it."
"Oh, work it," says Harry. "Probably the whole mountain is coal now you've got to it."
"Possibly it might not be much of a vein after all," suggested Philip.
"Possibly it is. I'll bet it's 40 feet thick. I told you. I knew the sort of thing as soon as I put my eyes on it."
Philip's next thought was to write to his friends and announce their good fortune. To Mr. Bolton he wrote a short business letter, as calm as he could make it. They had found coal of excellent quality, but they could not yet tell with absolute certainty what the vein was. The prospecting was still going on. Philip also wrote to Ruth, but though this letter may have glowed, it was not with the heat of burning anthracite. He needed no artificial heat to warm his pen and kindle his ardor when he sat down to write to Ruth. But it must be confessed that the words never flowed so easily before, and he ran on for an hour, disporting in all the extravagance of his imagination. When Ruth read it, she doubted if the fellow had not gone out of his senses, and it was not until she reached the postscript that she discovered the cause of the exhilaration. "P.S. We have found coal." The news couldn't have come to Mr. Bolton in a better time. He had never been so sorely pressed. A dozen schemes which he had in hand, any one of which might turn up a fortune, all languished, and each needed just a little more money to save that which had been invested. He hadn't a piece of real estate that was not covered with mortgages, even to the wild tract which Philip was experimenting on, and which had no marketable value above the encumbrance on it. He had come home that day early, unusually dejected.
"I am afraid," he said to his wife, "that we shall have to give up our house. I don't care for myself, but for thee and the children."
"That will be the least of misfortunes," said Mrs. Bolton cheerfully. "If thee can clear thyself from debt and anxiety which is wearing thee out, we can live anywhere. Thee knows we were never happier than when we were in a much humbler home."
"The truth is, Margaret, that affair of Bigler and Smalls has come on me just when I couldn't stand another ounce. They have made another failure of it. I might have known they would. And the sharpers, or fools, I don't know which, have contrived to involve me for 3 times as much as the first obligation. The security is in my hands, but it is good for nothing to me. I have not the money to do anything with the contract."
Ruth heard this dismal news without great surprise. She had long felt that they were living on a volcano that might go into active operation at any hour. Inheriting from her father an active brain and the courage to undertake new things, she had little of his sanguine temperament, which blinds one to difficulties and possible failures. She had little confidence in the many schemes which had been about to lift her father out of all his embarrassments and into great wealth ever since she was a child. As she grew older, she rather wondered that they were as prosperous as they seemed to be, and that they did not all go to smash amid so many brilliant projects. She was nothing but a woman, and did not know how much of the business prosperity of the world is only a bubble of credit and speculation, one scheme helping to float another which is no better than it, and the whole liable to come to naught and confusion as soon as the busy brain that conceived them ceases its power to devise, or when some accident produces a sudden panic.
"Perhaps I shall be the stay of the family yet," said Ruth, with an approach to gaiety. "When we move into a little house in town, will thee let me put a little sign on the door, 'Dr. Ruth Bolton'? Mrs. Dr. Longstreet, thee knows, has a great income."
"Who will pay for the sign, Ruth?" asked Mr. Bolton. A servant entered with the afternoon mail from the office. Mr. Bolton took his letters listlessly, dreading to open them. He knew well what they contained: new difficulties, more urgent demands for money. "Oh, here is one from Philip. Poor fellow, I shall feel his disappointment as much as my own bad luck. It is hard to bear when one is young." He opened the letter and read. As he read, his face lightened, and he fetched such a sigh of relief that Mrs. Bolton and Ruth both exclaimed. "Read that!" he cried. "Philip has found coal!" The world was changed in a moment. One little sentence had done it. There was no more trouble. Philip had found coal. That meant relief. That meant fortune. A great weight was taken off, and the spirits of the whole household rose magically. "Good money! Beautiful demon of money, what an enchanter thou art!" Ruth felt that she was of less consequence in the household now that Philip had found coal, and perhaps she was not sorry to feel so. Mr. Bolton was 10 years younger the next morning. He went into the city and showed his letter on 'Change. It was the sort of news his friends were quite willing to listen to. They took a new interest in him. If it was confirmed, Bolton would come right up again. There would be no difficulty about his getting all the money he wanted. The money market did not seem to be half so tight as it was the day before. Mr. Bolton spent a very pleasant day in his office, and went home revolving some new plans, and the execution of some projects he had long been prevented from entering upon by the lack of money. The day had been spent by Philip in no less excitement. By daylight, with Philip's letters to the mail, word had gone down to Ilium that coal had been found, and very early a crowd of eager spectators had come up to see for themselves. The prospecting continued day and night for upwards of a week, and during the first 4 or 5 days the indications grew more and more promising, and the telegrams and letters kept Mr. Bolton duly posted. But at last a change came, and the promises began to fail with alarming rapidity. In the end, it was demonstrated without the possibility of a doubt that the great "find" was nothing but a worthless scheme. Philip was cast down, all the more so because he had been so foolish as to send the news to Philadelphia before he knew what he was writing about, and now he must contradict it. "It turns out to be only a mere seam," he wrote, "but we look upon it as an indication of better further in." Alas, Mr. Bolton's affairs could not wait for indications. The future might have a great deal in store, but the present was black and hopeless. It was doubtful if any sacrifice could save him from ruin. Yet sacrifice he must make, and that instantly, in the hope of saving something from the wreck of his fortune. His lovely country home must go. That would bring the most ready money. The house that he had built with loving thought for each one of his family, as he planned its luxurious apartments and adorned it, the grounds that he had laid out with so much delight in following the tastes of his wife, with whom the country, the cultivation of rare trees and flowers, the care of garden and lawn and conservatories were a passion almost. This house, which he had hoped his children would enjoy long after he had done with it, must go. The family bore the sacrifice better than he did. They declared, in fact, women are such hypocrites, that they quite enjoyed the city. It was in August. After living so long in the country,
that it was 1,000 times more convenient in every respect. Mrs. Bolton said it was a relief from the worry of a large establishment, and Ruth reminded her father that she should have had to come to town anyway before long. Mr. Bolton was relieved, exactly as a waterlogged ship is lightened by throwing overboard the most valuable portion of the cargo, but the leak was not stopped. Indeed, his credit was injured instead of helped by the prudent step he had taken. It was regarded as a sure evidence of his embarrassment, and it was much more difficult for him to obtain help than if he had, instead of retrenching, launched into some new speculation. Philip was greatly troubled, and exaggerated his own share in the bringing about of the calamity. "You must not look at it so," Mr. Bolton wrote him. "You have neither helped nor hindered, but you know you may help by and by. It would have all happened just so, if we had never begun to dig that hole. That is only a drop. Work away. I still have hope that something will occur to relieve me. At any rate, we must not give up the mine, so long as we have any show." Alas, the relief did not come. New misfortunes came instead. When the extent of the Bigler's swindle was disclosed, there was no more hope that Mr. Bolton could extricate himself, and he had, as an honest man, no resource except to surrender all his property for the benefit of his creditors. The autumn came, and found Philip working with diminished force, but still with hope. He had again and again been encouraged by good indications, but he had again and again been disappointed. He could not go on much longer, and almost everybody except himself had thought it was useless to go on as long as he had been doing. When the news came of Mr. Bolton's failure, of course the work stopped. The men were discharged, the tools were housed, the hopeful noise of pickman and driver ceased, and the mining camp had that desolate and mournful aspect which always hovers over a frustrated enterprise. Philip sat down amid the ruins, and almost wished he were buried in them. How distant Ruth was now from him, now, when she might need him most. How changed was all the Philadelphia world, which had hitherto stood for the exemplification of happiness and prosperity. He still had faith that there was coal in that mountain. He made a picture of himself living there a hermit in a shanty by the tunnel, digging away with solitary pick and wheelbarrow day after day and year after year, until he grew gray and aged, and was known in all that region as the old man of the mountain. Perhaps some day, he felt it must be so some day, he should strike coal. But what if he did? Who would be alive to care for it then? What would he care for it then? No, a man wants riches in his youth, when the world is fresh to him. He wondered why Providence could not have reversed the usual process, and let the majority of men begin with wealth and gradually spend it and die poor when they no longer needed it. Harry went back to the city. It was evident that his services were no longer needed. Indeed, he had letters from his uncle, which he did not read to Philip, desiring him to go to San Francisco to look after some government contracts in the harbor there. Philip had to look about him for something to do. He was like Adam. The world was all before him where to choose. He made, before he went elsewhere, a somewhat painful visit to Philadelphia, painful, but yet not without its sweetnesses. The family had never shown him so much affection before. They all seemed to think his disappointment of more importance than their own misfortune. And there was that in Ruth's manner, in what she gave him and what she withheld, that would have made a hero of a very much less promising character than Philip Sterling. Among the assets of the Bolton property, the Ilium tract was sold, and Philip bought it in at the vendue for a song, for no one cared to even undertake the mortgage on it except himself. He went away the owner of it, and had ample time before he reached home in November to calculate how much poorer he was by possessing it. End of chapter 49. This is section 50 of The Gilded Age. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, by Mark Twain and C.D. Warner, Chapter 50. It is impossible for the historian, with even the best intentions, to control events or compel the persons of his narrative to act wisely or to be successful.
It is easy to see how things might have been better managed. A very little change here and there would have made a very different history of this one now in hand. If Philip had adopted some regular profession, even some trade, he might now be a prosperous editor, or a conscientious plumber, or an honest lawyer, and have borrowed money at the savings bank and built a cottage, and be now furnishing it for the occupancy of Ruth and himself. Instead of this, with only a smattering of civil engineering, he is at his mother's house, fretting and fuming over his ill luck, and the hardness and dishonesty of men, and thinking of nothing but how to get the coal out of the Ilium hills. If Senator Dilworthy had not made that visit to Hawkeye, the Hawkins family and Colonel Sellers would not now be dancing attendance upon Congress and endeavoring to tempt that immaculate body into one of those appropriations for the benefit of its members which the members find it so difficult to explain to their constituents, and Laura would not be lying in the Tombs awaiting her trial for murder, and doing her best, by the help of able counsel, to corrupt the pure fountain of criminal procedure in New York. If Henry Brierly had been blown up on the first Mississippi steamboat he set foot on, as the chances were that he would be, he and Colonel Sellers never would have gone into the Columbus navigation scheme, and probably never into the East Tennessee land scheme, and he would not now be detained in New York from very important business operations on the Pacific coast for the sole purpose of giving evidence to convict of murder the only woman he ever loved half as much as he loves himself. If Mr. Bolton had said the little word "no" to Mr. Bigler, Alice Montague might now be spending the winter in Philadelphia, and Philip also, waiting to resume his mining operations in the spring, and Ruth would not be an assistant in a Philadelphia hospital, taxing her strength with arduous routine duties day by day in order to lighten a little the burdens that weigh upon her unfortunate family. It is altogether a bad business. An honest historian, who had progressed thus far and traced everything to such a condition of disaster and suspension, might well be justified in ending his narrative and writing, "After this deluge." His only consolation would be in the reflection that he was not responsible for either characters or events. And the most annoying thought is that a little money, judiciously applied, would relieve the burdens and anxieties of most of these people. But affairs seem to be so arranged that money is most difficult to get when people need it most. A little of what Mr. Bolton has weekly given to unworthy people would now establish his family in a sort of comfort, and relieve Ruth of the excessive toil for which she inherited no adequate physical vigor. A little money would make a prince of Colonel Sellers, and a little more would calm the anxiety of Washington Hawkins about Laura, for however the trial ended, he could feel sure of extricating her in the end. And if Philip had a little money, he could unlock the stone door in the mountain whence would issue a stream of shining riches. It needs a golden wand to strike that rock. If the Knobs University bill could only go through, what a change would be wrought in the condition of most of the persons in this history. Even Philip himself would feel the good effects of it, for Harry would have something and Colonel Sellers would have something, and have not both these cautious people expressed a determination to take an interest in the Ilium mine when they catch their larks? Philip could not resist the inclination to pay a visit to Fallkill. He had not been at the Montagues since the time he saw Ruth there, and he wanted to consult the squire about an occupation. He was determined now to waste no more time in waiting on Providence, but to go to work at something, if it were nothing better than teaching in the Fallkill Seminary, or digging clams on Hingham Beach. Perhaps he could read law in Squire Montague's office while earning his bread as a teacher in the seminary. It was not altogether Philip's fault, let us own, that he was in this position. There are many young men like him in American society, of his age, opportunities, education, and abilities, who have really been educated for nothing and have let themselves drift, in the hope that they will find somehow, and by some sudden turn of luck, the golden road to fortune. He was not idle or lazy, he had energy and a disposition to carve his own way. But he was born into a time when all young men of his age caught the fever of speculation, and expected to get on in the world by the omission of some of the regular processes which have been appointed from of old. and examples were not wanting to encourage him. He saw people all around him, poor yesterday, rich today, who had come into sudden opulence by some means which they could not have classified among any of the regular occupations of life. A war would give such a fellow a career and very likely fame. He might have been a railroad man, or a politician, or a land speculator, or one of those mysterious people who travel free on all railroads and steamboats, and are continually crossing and recrossing the Atlantic, driven day and night about nobody knows what, and make a great deal of money by so doing. Probably, at last, he sometimes thought with a whimsical smile, he should end by being an insurance agent, and asking people to insure their lives for his benefit. Possibly Philip did not think how much the attractions of Fallkill were increased by the presence of Alice there. He had known her so long, she had somehow grown into his life by habit, that he would expect the pleasure of her society without thinking much about it. Latterly he never thought of her without thinking of Ruth, and if he gave the subject any attention, it was probably in an undefined consciousness that he had her sympathy in his love, and that she was always willing to hear him talk about it. If he ever wondered that Alice herself was not in love and never spoke of the possibility of her own marriage, it was a transient thought, for love did not seem necessary exactly to one so calm and evenly balanced, and with so many resources in herself. Whatever her thoughts may have been, they were unknown to Philip, as they are to these historians. If she was seeming to be what she was not, and carrying a burden heavier than anyone else carried, because she had to bear it alone, she was only doing what thousands of women do, with a self-renunciation and heroism of which men, impatient and complaining, have no conception. Have not these big babies with beards filled all literature with their outcries, their griefs, and their lamentations? It is always the gentle sex which is hard and cruel and fickle and implacable.
"Do you think you would be contented to live in Fallkill and attend the county court?"
asked Alice, when Philip had opened the budget of his new program. "Perhaps not always," said Philip. "I might go and practice in Boston, maybe, or go to Chicago."
"Or you might get elected to Congress."
Philip looked at Alice to see if she was in earnest and not chaffing him. Her face was quite sober. Alice was one of those patriotic women in the rural districts who think men are still selected for Congress on account of qualifications for the office. "No," said Philip. "The chances are that a man cannot get into Congress now without resorting to arts and means that should render him unfit to go there. Of course there are exceptions. But do you know that I could not go into politics if I were a lawyer, without losing standing somewhat in my profession, and without raising at least a suspicion of my intentions and unselfishness? Why, it is telegraphed all over the country and commented on as something wonderful if a congressman votes honestly and unselfishly and refuses to take advantage of his position to steal from the government."
"But," insisted Alice, "I should think it a noble ambition to go to Congress, if it is so bad, and help reform it. I don't believe it as corrupt as the English Parliament used to be, if there is any truth in the novels, and I suppose that is reformed."
"I'm sure I don't know where the reform is to begin. I've seen a perfectly capable, honest man, time and again, run against an illiterate trickster and get beaten. I suppose if the people wanted decent members of Congress they would elect them. Perhaps," continued Philip with a smile, "the women will have to vote."
"Well, I should be willing to, if it were a necessity, just as I would go to war and do what I could, if the country couldn't be saved otherwise," said Alice, with a spirit that surprised Philip, well as he thought he knew her. "If I were a young gentleman in these times—"
Philip laughed outright. "It's just what Ruth used to say, if she were a man. I wonder if all the young ladies are contemplating a change of sex."
"No, only a changed sex," retorted Alice. "We contemplate for the most part young men who don't care for anything they ought to care for."
"Well," said Philip, looking humble, "I care for some things, you and Ruth, for instance. Perhaps I ought not to. Perhaps I ought to care for Congress and that sort of thing."
"Don't be a goose, Philip. I heard from Ruth yesterday."
"Can I see her letter?"
"No, indeed. But I am afraid her hard work is telling on her, together with her anxiety about her father."
"Do you think, Alice, asked Philip, with one of those selfish thoughts that are not seldom mixed with real love.
That Ruth prefers her profession to marriage?
"Philip!" exclaimed Alice, rising to quit the room, and speaking hurriedly as if the words were forced from her.
"You are as blind as a bat. Ruth would cut off her right hand for you this minute."
Philip never noticed that Alice's face was flushed and that her voice was unsteady. He only thought of the delicious words he had heard, and the poor girl, loyal to Ruth, loyal to Philip, went straight to her room, locked the door, threw herself on the bed, and sobbed as if her heart would break. And then she prayed that her Father in heaven would give her strength, and after a time she was calm again, and went to her bureau drawer and took from a hiding-place a little piece of paper, yellow with age. Upon it was pinned a four-leafed clover, dry and yellow also. She looked long at this foolish memento. Under the clover-leaf was written in a schoolgirl's hand, "Philip, June, 1860 blank." Squire Montague thought very well of Philip's proposal. It would have been better if he had begun the study of law as soon as he left college, but it was not too late now, and besides, he had gathered some knowledge of the world.
"But," asked the squire, "do you mean to abandon your land in Pennsylvania?"
This tract of land seemed an immense possible fortune to this New England lawyer-farmer.
"Hasn't it good timber, and doesn't the railroad almost touch it?"
"I can't do anything with it now. Perhaps I can sometime."
"What is your reason for supposing that there is coal there?"
"The opinion of the best geologist I could consult, my own observation of the country, and the little veins of it we found. I feel certain it is there. I shall find it some day. I know it, if I can only keep the land till I make money enough to try again." Philip took from his pocket a map of the anthracite coal region, and pointed out the position of the Ilium mountain which he had begun to tunnel. "Doesn't it look like it?"
"Well, it certainly does,"
said the squire, very much interested. It is not unusual for a quiet country gentleman to be more taken with such a venture than a speculator who has had more experience in its uncertainty. It was astonishing how many New England clergymen, in the time of the petroleum excitement, took chances in oil. The Wall Street brokers are said to do a good deal of small business for country clergymen, who are moved, no doubt, with the laudable desire of purifying the New York Stock Board.
"I don't see that there is much risk," said the squire at length. "The timber is worth more than the mortgage, and if that coal seam does run there, it's a magnificent fortune. Would you like to try it again in the spring, Phil?"
Like to try it? If he could have a little help, he would work himself with pick and barrow and live on a crust. Only give him one more chance. And this is how it came about that the cautious old Squire Montague was drawn into this young fellow's speculation, and began to have his serene old age disturbed by anxieties and by the hope of a great stroke of luck.
"To be sure, I only care about it for the boy," he said.
The squire was like everybody else. Sooner or later he must take a chance. It is probably on account of the lack of enterprise in women that they are not so fond of stock speculations and mine ventures as men. It is only when woman becomes demoralized that she takes to any sort of gambling. Neither Alice nor Ruth were much elated with the prospect of Philip's renewal of his mining enterprise. But Philip was exultant. He wrote to Ruth as if his fortune were already made, and as if the clouds that lowered over the house of Bolton were already in the deep bosom of a coal mine buried. Towards spring he went to Philadelphia with his plans all matured for a new campaign. His enthusiasm was irresistible.
"Philip has come! Philip has come!"
cried the children, as if some great good had again come into the household, and the refrain even sang itself over in Ruth's heart as she went the weary hospital rounds. Mr. Bolton felt more courage than he had had in months at the sight of his manly face and the sound of his cheery voice. Ruth's course was vindicated now, and it certainly did not become Philip, who had nothing to offer but a future chance against the visible result of her determination and industry, to open an argument with her. Ruth was never more certain that she was right, and that she was sufficient unto herself. She, maybe, did not much heed the still small voice that sang in her maiden heart as she went about her work, and which lightened it and made it easy. "Philip has come."
"I am glad for father's sake," she said to Philip, "that thee has come. I can see that he depends greatly upon what thee can do. He thinks women won't hold out long," added Ruth, with a smile that Philip never exactly understood.
"And aren't you tired sometimes of the struggle?"
"Tired? Yes, everybody is tired, I suppose. But it is a glorious profession. And would you want me to be dependent, Philip?"
"Well, yes, a little," said Philip, feeling his way towards what he wanted to say.
"On what, for instance, just now?"
asked Ruth, a little maliciously, Philip thought.
Why, on—
He couldn't quite say it, for it occurred to him that he was a poor stick for anybody to lean on in the present state of his fortune,
and that the woman before him was at least as independent as he was.
"I don't mean depend," he began again. "But I love you, that's all. Am I nothing to you?"
and Philip looked a little defiant, and as if he had said something that ought to brush away all the sophistries of obligation on either side between man and woman. Perhaps Ruth saw this. Perhaps she saw that her own theories of a certain equality of power which ought to precede a union of two hearts might be pushed too far. Perhaps she had felt sometimes her own weakness, and the need after all of so dear a sympathy and so tender an interest confessed as that which Philip could give. Whatever moved her, the riddle is as old as creation. She simply looked up to Philip and said in a low voice,
"Everything."
And Philip, clasping both her hands in his, and looking down into her eyes, which drank in all his tenderness with the thirst of a true woman's nature—
"Oh, Philip, come out here!"
shouted young Eli, throwing the door wide open, and Ruth escaped away to her room, her heart singing again, and now as if it would burst for joy, "Philip has come." That night Philip received a dispatch from Harry. The trial begins today. End of chapter 50.